Hey everyone, love scary stories? Then hit that subscribe button and become part of the creepy crew. Leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from. Let's jump right in. I was 20 when I finally left my parents' house. It took me longer than it did for most of my friends. While everyone else had already moved into dorms, apartments, or was living with roommates, I stayed behind. Part of me felt safe staying at home. My dad worked construction, and my mom was a teacher, so they didn't mind having me around, even after I graduated. I'd help out when I could, but honestly, I wasn't in a rush to start paying bills. It was 2009, right after the economic crash, and jobs were hard to come by. It felt like I was stuck, just drifting in limbo. My parents didn't push me too hard, but I knew they hoped I would figure out my next steps soon. Then one day, an old family friend reached out, Kyle and Amy Lanka. They'd been close to my parents for as long as I could remember. Every holiday, Thanksgiving, 4th of July, they'd be there, hanging out, telling stories, laughing together. Kyle was a big guy, ex-contractor, and always had some crazy story to tell. Amy was the quieter one, sweet, always checking on me, asking if I needed anything. They seemed happy enough, but now that I think back, I realize I never really understood them as well as I thought. They lived in a nice big house in a quiet neighborhood, but the recession had hit them hard. Bills were stacking up, and even with Kyle's retirement savings, they needed extra cash. They decided to rent out a room, but didn't want just anyone. They wanted someone they trusted, so my parents suggested me. At first, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. I'd get my own room in a big house, cheap rent, and I could still keep my part-time job while saving up for something more permanent. Kyle and Amy felt like family, so it felt safe. It seemed like the right thing to do. My parents were thrilled. "You're lucky they're offering this," my dad said. "It's a great first step." So, I took it. Moving was easy enough. Kyle came over one Saturday morning to help me with my stuff. His truck was full of boxes and the few pieces of furniture I owned. Amy had set up the guest room for me. It was nice, bigger than my old room, with a huge window that looked out over their backyard. There was this big oak tree that shaded the whole yard. It felt like a fresh start, like I was finally doing something on my own. The first few weeks went by peacefully, almost too peacefully. The house was big enough that I had a lot of privacy. I'd come home from my part-time job, make a quick sandwich or heat up some leftovers, then head to my room to either watch TV or play some games. I didn't see Kyle or Amy much, except for passing by each other. Kyle was usually in the garage working on his old truck, and Amy was either cleaning up or watching TV in the living room. It didn't bother me. I liked the space. It was calm, but after a little while, things started to feel off. I remember the first time I noticed it. It was a Wednesday afternoon. I had gotten off work earlier than usual. My shift was shorter that day, and I was looking forward to a quiet afternoon before the weekend rush. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Kyle storming out of the house, looking like he was about to explode. His face was red, and he was fuming with anger. At first, he didn't notice me. He was too focused on getting into his truck. He slammed the door so hard I heard it from inside my car, and then he just sped off, tires screeching as he flew down the street. I sat there for a moment, just staring after him. I'd never seen Kyle like that before. He was always the kind of guy who cracked jokes, told stories, and was always laughing. This was different. This wasn't just being mad. This was rage. Real, raw anger. I didn't know what to think of it, but I figured maybe something happened at work or with money. Everyone has a bad day, right? When I walked inside, the house felt off. The quiet wasn't the peaceful, relaxing kind I was used to. It felt heavy, stifling. Then I heard soft sobbing from the living room. I walked around the corner and saw Amy sitting on the couch, her head in her hands, crying. "Amy?" I called out. She didn't answer right away. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red and puffy, her face streaked with tears. When she saw me, she quickly wiped her face and forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, hey. I didn't hear you come in. Everything okay?" I paused, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, I just got off early." "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked, my voice gentle. She waved her hand like it was nothing, brushing off my concern. "Oh, yeah, I'm fine. Just a rough day." But something in her voice didn't match her words. It felt like she was hiding something. "Oh, it's nothing really," Amy said quickly, wiping her eyes. "Just a little thing. Don't worry about it. Hey, how about some lunch?" I was just about to make something. I opened my mouth to ask more, but something about how she changed the subject so fast made me hesitate. It was like she was trying to hide something. I didn't push her, even though every part of me felt that something wasn't right. I just nodded and followed her to the kitchen, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. After that, things in the house started to shift. At first, it was small stuff, little changes in how Kyle and Amy treated each other. Kyle's tone when he spoke to her started to feel different. He'd get short with her, speaking in a cold, almost mocking way. He'd mutter things under his breath as he passed her, like how she hadn't cleaned enough or how dinner was late. Amy would laugh it off, but I saw how her hands shook when she thought I wasn't looking. The tension between them grew every day, and I found myself walking on eggshells trying to avoid both of them. Kyle spent more time in the garage, drinking beer alone. The cans piled up faster than they used to, and it didn't take long before I started hearing their fights at night. At first, it was just yelling, muffled through the walls, but I could tell they were arguing about something serious. I couldn't make out the words, but the anger in their voices was obvious. Frustration, resentment, like they were just holding on to whatever was left of their relationship by a thread. One night, things took a darker turn. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the usual sounds of their fighting, when suddenly there was a loud crash, like something heavy slamming into the wall. The sound rattled the house, followed by Amy's voice, high-pitched, desperate, almost frantic. Then I heard the thudding of footsteps. At first, I thought Kyle had just stormed out again, but then it hit me. He wasn't leaving. He was chasing her. My heart started to race. I sat up in bed, listening. The footsteps were getting louder, closer, faster, almost like a stampede. My brain was scrambling to make sense of what was happening. Was he hurting her? I felt my stomach turn as I heard another crash. This one closer, followed by a sharp scream from Amy. Without thinking, I jumped out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the closet. My hands were shaking as I stepped into the hallway, the darkness pressing in around me. I could hear them, Amy sobbing, Kyle's heavy breathing, his angry, slurred shouts. They were coming right for me. I froze in place, unsure of what to do. The hallway was long, with a few twists and turns. I stood still, holding my breath, knowing they were just around the corner. Then, suddenly, Amy appeared in the dim light, stumbling down the hallway. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. When she saw me, she ran toward me, grabbing my arm with both hands, her grip tight and trembling. "Please," she gasped, her voice panicked. "Help me, he's gonna—" Before she could finish, Kyle came around the corner. He was definitely drunk, his movements slow but determined. The rage in his eyes was unmistakable. He was a mess. Beer stains on his shirt, face red, eyes wild and bloodshot, like he wasn't even all there anymore. He stumbled toward us, using the wall to keep himself upright, getting closer with every shaky step. I didn't think, I just acted. I raised the bat and swung with everything I had. The crack when it hit his head was sickening. Kyle dropped to the floor, his body hitting the ground with a thud, like a sack of bricks. For a moment, everything went silent. Too silent. The only sounds I could hear were the hum of the fridge in the kitchen and the quiet ticking of the wall clock. The house felt like it was holding its breath, like the air itself was waiting for something else to break. Honestly, I thought he was dead. Amy was still gripping my arm, shaking like a leaf. I could feel her pulse pounding through her fingers. I stood there, bat in hand, staring at Kyle's still body, my mind scrambling to catch up with what had just happened. Then, just as I started to panic, I saw Kyle move. A low groan escaped him. He was stirring. He wasn't dead. I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding. "Oh my God," Amy whispered, her voice shaking. What? What do we do now?" I blinked, shaking myself out of the daze. "We need to call the cops. Now." Amy nodded but didn't move. She was still staring at Kyle, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The operator answered quickly. I rushed through what happened, telling her where we were and what had gone down. She told me to stay on the line until the police arrived, but I could barely focus on her voice. All I could think was, what if Kyle wakes up? What if he's not out for long? The minutes dragged on. It felt like hours. Finally, I heard the wail of sirens in the distance. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, casting eerie glows on the walls. 2 officers stormed through the front door, guns drawn. I dropped the bat immediately and raised my hands, showing I wasn't a threat. Amy collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, as the officers cuffed Kyle and moved him to the corner. He was yelling at them, demanding they get out of his house. I gave my statement, trying to explain everything that happened, though it felt like I was watching it all from somewhere far away. As the cops dragged Kyle out, one of the officers came over to me. He looked serious, his face grim. "You did the right thing, kid," he said quietly. "This isn't the first time we've been called here." Those words hit me like a slap. I'd been living there for a few months, completely unaware of what was happening under my nose. I'd known something was off, but I never did anything about it. I never knew just how bad it was until that night. This happened last year when I was 31. I had married when I was 26, and things were pretty good for the first couple of years. But by the time our 4th anniversary rolled around, it was clear we were more like roommates than anything else. After that, it was pretty much over. Since I was the guy, I had to leave our house. Between the legal costs and the bank taking their share, there wasn't much left, so my ex was soon living on her own too. To make things worse, my job was cutting staff around that time, and I figured I was next. I started thinking about moving back in with my parents, but I didn't want to commit to a full year of rent just in case I was still employed. I decided to hold on to the job for as long as I could, just in case they didn't fire me. So, I went for a short-term rental while I sorted everything out. At 31, I never imagined I'd end up in a shared house again. But that's exactly what happened. I found the place through Craigslist and decided to check it out. A friendly older guy showed me the room, which had its own bathroom and was pretty spacious. The rent was $800 a month, which was a steal for my city. I took it right away and paid him in full. He said I could stay on a month-to-month basis if I wanted, which worked for me. I moved in a few days later with just a suitcase of clothes and a few other things I had in storage. On my first night, I met a young couple from Germany. They were in their early 20s, full of energy and optimism, which was pretty different from how I was feeling at the time. I was bitter and a bit jaded, but I tried not to let it show. We sat down for dinner together. They cooked pasta and offered me some, which I accepted. They told me they'd be moving out soon, even though they had only been in the house for a few weeks before I got there. When I asked why, they hesitated, but eventually said it was because of a problem with one of the other housemates. They didn't get into specifics, but it was clear the guy they were talking about had shaken them up. Apparently, he lived in the basement and was hard to get along with. The couple headed to bed early, and I went to my room around 9 p.m. A few days later, they were gone, and someone else had moved in. I met him briefly, but I didn't get a chance to talk to him much. I didn't meet the guy in the basement until about a week later. I was in the kitchen, and he walked in. The moment I saw him, I knew he must be the one the German couple had mentioned. I didn't want to bring it up, so I acted like I didn't know anything. I introduced myself politely, but something about him gave me a weird feeling right away. His name was Tom, and he was around 24. He was very thin with a scruffy beard that looked like he didn't care to tidy it up. When we talked, he came off as awkward, like he hadn't interacted with anyone in ages. I asked him what kind of work he did, but he dodged the question completely. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he just turned around and went back to the basement. It was definitely strange, but if that was the only thing that bothered the couple, I'd probably think they were exaggerating. At the time, I just thought he was a bit odd, but things got a lot worse after that. The next week was pretty uneventful. Work was dull, but I was thankful I still had a job. I was settling into the routine of my new life and mostly kept to myself. The house was pretty quiet, and I didn't see much of anyone since I spent most of my time in my room. Then, one night, everything took a turn. I was sitting in my room, reading a book, when I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't planning on answering, but then I heard someone say it was the police. I got up and opened the door just enough to see who it was. Sure enough, there were 2 officers standing there. I had no idea when they'd even come into the house. Then again, I didn't usually keep track of everyone coming and going, especially with so many people living there. One of the officers told me they were investigating a possible theft. Then, to my shock, I learned that Tom had accused me. I was completely stunned. I had barely even spoken to the guy, let alone stolen anything from him. The officers asked if they could search my room. Even though I've since learned that I should have refused, I agreed right away. At the time, I thought refusing would make me look guilty. But looking back, I realize it wouldn't have mattered. They can't use that against you anyway. So, I let them search, thinking it was no big deal. I had nothing to hide. To my surprise, they found Tom's wallet and a few other items hidden in my closet. I couldn't believe it. I was certain he'd planted them there. After the police left, I was both angry and terrified. I had no idea what Tom was trying to do. Despite my better judgment, I decided to confront him the next day. When I went down to the basement, he wasn't there. His door was locked, but I could hear faint music playing inside. He always left his music on, even when he wasn't home. Something about that made my skin crawl. I banged on his door, but there was no response. It felt like he was purposely ignoring me. I went back to my room, locked the door, and sat on my bed, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about what could happen next. For the next few days, I did my best to avoid Tom. I barely left my room except for work, and when I was home, I made sure to stay out of sight as much as possible. I felt like I was being hunted, like someone was always watching me. Every noise made me jump, and every shadow felt like it could be him. One night, well past midnight, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I realized it was something else, something coming from outside my door. Someone was trying to get into my room. My heart slammed against my chest, and I quickly grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a thick hardcover book. It was a stupid weapon, but I had no choice. I moved silently to the door, holding my breath, and pressed my ear against it. There was definitely someone messing with the lock. My stomach turned. I didn't think. I just swung the door open. And there he was, Tom. He jumped back, wide-eyed and looking caught off guard, but I could tell he wasn't sorry. He tried to make up some excuse, but I could see through it. He'd been trying to break in, probably planning his next move. Maybe to plant something in my room to blame me for whatever scheme he had going. I told him to leave and never come near my room again. He mumbled an apology and shuffled downstairs, but I was too shaken to feel relieved. I locked the door behind me, staying awake for a while, straining my ears for any signs of him. The silence was suffocating. The next day, I called the landlord. I explained everything, from the wallet incident to Tom's creepy behavior. But all he said was that there wasn't much he could do. He acted like I was overreacting. I was furious. I started looking for a new place immediately, scouring Craigslist and asking around at work for leads. A few days later, I was sitting in the living room, trying to relax, when Tom came upstairs. He was acting like everything was normal, like he hadn't just tried to break into my room days earlier. I ignored him completely. He stood there for a moment, looking uncomfortable, and then shuffled off to the kitchen. I saw my chance to leave, and I took it. I needed air. When I got back later that evening, I was ready for the worst. Tom was standing in the hallway, looking more disheveled than usual. His eyes were red, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't waste time. As soon as I stepped inside, he started shouting at me. He accused me of trying to turn everyone in the house against him. I just wanted to get past him and go to my room. but he stepped into my path. As soon as I tried to move around him, he grabbed me by the neck. It happened so fast. My heart skipped, and all I could think was that I had to get away. I managed to twist out of his grip and shove him back, stumbling toward my room. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking, but I pulled out my phone and called the cops. I told them about the attack, but when they arrived, there were no witnesses. It was just my word against his. But when Tom opened the door to the cops, he didn't deny what happened. He admitted enough for them to arrest him. They took him away, but even then, I wasn't sure what to think. Tom was gone for a week, but that was when I packed up and left. I hadn't planned on staying longer than a month anyway, and since I'd already paid up front, I wasn't stuck. It felt like a relief, but a part of me was still on edge. I didn't trust anyone anymore. I moved to a new place, paid for my own apartment, and it was much better than living with strangers. Luckily, I never lost my job. It was strange to think I almost did, considering everything that happened. I'm just glad I got out of that place. I don't ever want to live with roommates again. This happened when I was 19, and looking back, I can't believe how dumb I was. I had been arguing with my mom a lot, and being young and stubborn, I decided to move out and live with this guy I was dating. He wasn't the best choice, but I thought I knew better than anyone at that age. He was a bit sketchy, and his friends weren't exactly people I'd want around, but I ignored all the red flags. Things didn't last long in the place we were renting, so a guy my boyfriend had worked with offered us a place to stay. We didn't have a car and I wasn't working at the time. My boyfriend was job hunting, so we were both pretty much stuck there. The guy we were staying with worked nights, so during the day, it was just me and him in the trailer. At first, it wasn't too bad. He was an alcoholic, but not the violent kind. He just drank a lot and was always kind of there, not doing much. He would stare at me a lot, which was unsettling, but I brushed it off. I was young and naive and didn't think too much of it. The trailer we were in wasn't great either. It was small and had these weird plastic curtain things instead of real doors. The guy's room had an actual door, but the rest of us had to make do with curtains that never really closed. This detail matters later. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The guy shared his beer with us and mostly kept to himself. But one day, when my boyfriend went out job hunting, it got weird. I was just sitting in the living room playing solitaire, listening to the radio, when the guy came out of his room. He started staring at me again. I felt uncomfortable, but didn't think too much of it. He just sat there, drinking beer and watching me for what felt like forever. After a while, he said he was going to take a nap. Then, things got worse. I heard strange noises coming from his room, groans and grunts that made my skin crawl. I won't get into the details, but it was unsettling. I tried to ignore it, though. He was letting us stay there rent-free, so I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. My boyfriend came back eventually, and everything seemed normal again, like nothing had happened. I was still creeped out, but I went for a walk with my boyfriend later and told him about the noises. He wasn't as concerned as I thought he should be, but I didn't press it. The next day, the exact same thing happened again. So, one day my boyfriend left early to look for work, and I was stuck alone with that weird roommate again. I was just chilling in the living room, playing cards and listening to the radio like I did the day before. And just like before, he came out, grabbed a beer, and started staring at me from across the room. After a while, he said something about taking a nap. But this time, things took an even creepier turn. I heard him start yelling my name, loudly. It was unnerving, to say the least. I was already feeling weird about the whole situation, but I just stayed quiet, hoping he'd stop. Thankfully, when my boyfriend came back, the guy shut up and acted normal again. We went for a walk, and I told my boyfriend about it, but he didn't seem too worried. He thought the guy was just a bit strange, but harmless. The next day, the exact same thing happened. My boyfriend left, and there I was again, sitting alone in the living room, playing cards. The guy came out, drank, and just stared at me for a while. This time, he actually started talking to me. The conversation was really awkward. He asked about how things had been going, like we were friends or something. I could barely hold it together, so I told him I was going outside to wait for my boyfriend. When my boyfriend got back, I told him everything again. This time, he suggested we go get my dog from my mom's house. I had this little Pomeranian at the time, and he was small, but really aggressive. At least I felt a little safer with the dog around, even if he was small. That night, my boyfriend had to stay at his friend's place to help him move, which meant I was alone with the guy again. Bad idea. I decided to stay in our bedroom with the dog that night, instead of sitting in the living room, just in case things got worse. I figured I'd take a nap early since I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep later. The bedroom had those annoying curtain doors, so I locked my dog in his crate to keep him safe, and then I lay down to nap under the blanket. The next thing I know, I woke up to my dog freaking out. He was barking, growling, and snarling in his crate like there was something really wrong. I slowly turned my head, trying not to move too much, and I could see the door from where I was laying. I was terrified because I knew there was no real escape from the room. The guy could come in any time, and I had nothing to defend myself except my little dog. I tried to act like I was still asleep, hoping he wouldn't know I was awake. I rolled over, making sure my back was to him, but keeping an eye on the door. My heart was pounding, and I was praying my dog would keep making noise to keep him away. The guy opened the door wider, but he didn't come in. He just stood there watching me. I could feel my heart racing. I quickly scooted into the corner of the room, trying to get as far from him as I could. He was still staring at me like some kind of predator. I forced myself to ask, "Can I help you with something?" He made this strange, low sound, almost like a grunt, and then he turned and walked off down the hallway. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my dog's leash, feeling like I needed to get the hell out of that place, like now. I stepped into the living room, ready to leave, but as soon as I walked in, he was sitting on the couch again, just staring. And then he started talking. "So, I don't think this is working out. Maybe your boyfriend should find somewhere else to stay." I was so done at that point. "Yeah, you're probably right. I'll tell him when he gets back and we'll figure it out. I'm just gonna take the dog for a walk," I said, trying to sound calm even though I was freaking out inside. I decided to head to my boyfriend's friend's house. There was no way I was sticking around there alone with that guy. I walked out, and the guy just kept staring after me. But something told me that wasn't the last I'd see of him. I started walking down the road, and not even half a mile away, I heard the sound of a moped behind me. I thought maybe he was going for a beer run or something. I stepped aside so I wouldn't be in his way when he passed by, but instead of just riding past, he pulled up right next to me. Then he started yelling. "You led me on!" he screamed. "We've got until tonight to get out of my house!" His voice was so loud and frantic, I seriously thought he might try something. I stood there frozen, waiting for him to get violent. But after 10 minutes of him yelling at me, he finally hopped back on his moped and sped off. I didn't wait around to find out if he was coming back. I just took off in the opposite direction, running as fast as I could. It was close to midnight by then, pitch black out, and we were in a pretty rural area. No streetlights, just dark roads for miles. I didn't even stop to grab anything. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell away from that guy. I ended up walking the whole way to my boyfriend's friend's house, which was at least 6 miles away, maybe more. It was a long, lonely walk through the dark, but I didn't feel safe anywhere else. A couple of days later, we got a ride back to the guy's house to grab our stuff while he was at work. He'd told us he left it on the porch, but when we got there, it was way worse than I thought. All my underwear was gone, and some of my clothes had been cut up, sliced into pieces like they'd been deliberately ruined. It was beyond creepy. We threw most of it away right there. Later, we found out that he had a reputation in the area. People called him Uncle Perv because a few years earlier, he had gotten in trouble for doing the same kind of messed up stuff to someone else. I didn't even want to know what else he'd done. This happened when I was about 15 or 16, and I'm 20 now. I just realized how messed up everything was after looking back at it. I was still living with my parents at the time, but my older sister, who's 7 years older than me, had moved out. She was living with her husband, his childhood best friend, and some random guy who they found through one of those roommate websites. This guy, William, was kind of a recluse. He spent all his time in his room watching Star Trek and playing video games. He hardly ever hung out with the others, and the only person he seemed to talk to was his girlfriend, Amber, who was just as shy and weird as he was. For some background, at the time, William was 28 and Amber was 24. They were both odd, but seemed harmless at first. For simplicity, let's call the normal roommate Frank, and the strange ones William and Amber. Now, to give you an idea of what was going on at home, my relationship with our parents wasn't great. Things were especially bad then because our mom was dating this guy who was an absolute jerk. He treated me horribly, picking fights over the smallest things. So, I spent a lot of time over at my sister's place to get away from him. Around that time, William and Amber started acting even stranger. Like I said, they were already a bit off, only really talking to each other and ignoring anyone else who tried to speak to them. Amber was the worst, though. She would just stare at you like you were invisible. And if you said something to her, she would turn and walk away without a word. William at least gave short answers, but Amber? Nothing. That was bad enough, but it didn't stop there. When I stayed over, I would sleep on a futon in Frank's office, which was on the first floor. It was right next to the bathroom, which for some reason Amber preferred. She would take long showers in the middle of the night. I'm a heavy sleeper, so it didn't usually bother me. But one night, I was up late working on some homework. I was so focused that I barely noticed anything until I heard the shower turn off. That was a sign it was getting late, so I looked up from my laptop. That's when I saw her. I always left the door to Frank's office open just a little bit. It got so hot in there if I didn't, and I couldn't stand it. One night, after I'd been working for hours, I glanced up from my laptop and saw her, Amber, standing in the hallway, completely naked, just staring at me through the small gap in the door. It was so unsettling. I froze for a second before I said her name. I asked if she was okay, but it seemed like my voice startled her, and she quickly walked off. I tried to brush it off, convinced I'd imagined the whole thing since I'd barely slept and had way too much caffeine. I didn't mention it to anyone. A few weeks later, I went to my sister's place to find Frank looking pretty upset. He had discovered fingerprints on the outside of his office window. They were in a position that made it obvious someone had been pressing against the glass, trying to look inside. The blinds in Frank's office were too small for the window, so it was easy to see into the room from outside. The window was also right at the front of the house, just above the street. Frank was paranoid, thinking some random pervert had been spying on him, or maybe even a burglar had been sizing up the house. He called the cops, but without any outside cameras, they couldn't find anything to go on, and nothing came of it. Not long after that, Frank installed cameras around the house, both inside and outside. This happened while William and Amber were away on a trip, so I guess nobody told them about it. A couple of months later, I went to my sister's place again and found that William's room was empty. When I asked what happened, they told me that William and Amber had been kicked out. Apparently, they were both just way too creepy. Amber watching me through the office door wasn't a one-time thing. The security footage showed that she'd been doing it regularly, sometimes for 20 or 30 minutes at a time. I was always asleep when it happened, but still. Even worse, the fingerprints on the window weren't just from Amber. Apparently, they were from William, who'd been standing outside, watching me after I'd taken a shower, just wearing a towel. That wasn't something I did often, but I guess it had happened enough for it to be concerning. I was honestly pretty disturbed by all of it, but the worst part came later. I was hanging out with my sister and her husband a few weeks ago, and he said something that made my stomach drop. He said he wished they'd told me everything back then so I could have pressed charges. I asked him what he meant, and he explained. Not only had they been spying on me, but the security footage also showed William messing with the food I brought over. I had no idea at the time, but apparently he'd been licking my apples, and Amber had spit into my orange juice. They'd even poured regular milk into my lactose-free stuff, which explained why I'd felt so sick out of nowhere. Frank had also found some of my clothes that I thought I'd lost, shirts that had been stolen and then hung up on their wall. Along with the shirts were creepy drawings of me sleeping and weird poems. Frank never told me exactly what they said, and honestly, I'm glad. I don't want to know. After finding all this, Frank lost it. He told them they had 2 hours to get out of the house and never contact any of them again, or he'd call the cops. They left. But I still get a sick feeling whenever I think about what they were planning to do. A few summers ago, Kelsey and I were practically inseparable. We were together almost every weekend, and if we could, we'd sneak out on weekdays too, just to hang out. Kelsey lived in a small apartment on the other side of town, where everything seemed to happen. There were great restaurants, bars, and even a few nightclubs that didn't always ask for IDs. We were only 20 at the time, so we weren't able to go wild, but we still found ways to have fun. Kelsey's place quickly became our little escape, somewhere we could pre-game, have a few drinks, and then crash on the couch, watching some cheesy movie until we passed out. Those were some of the best moments of my life. I don't think I've ever felt that free. There's something special about those long summer nights, where the warmth sticks around even after the sun sets. The air felt heavy with excitement, like anything could happen. We'd wander through the streets, laughing, sometimes stumbling from too many free drinks. But we didn't care. We were in our own little bubble. Kelsey had this way of making everything feel like an adventure. She could talk to anyone, and her energy just drew people in. That's probably why I felt so drawn to her. She made me feel alive. Then came Shad. It started harmless enough. Kelsey met him at a bar one night and we all clicked right away. He was the type of guy who fit in with us, always up for a good time, always ready for more drinks, and would stay up with us laughing until the sun came up. He was tall, with a shaved head and a tattoo on his neck that gave him an edge, something Kelsey seemed to like. At first, I didn't mind him tagging along. The more the merrier, right? He made us laugh, knew all the best bars, and always had suggestions for one more shot or another round. Plus, he wasn't broke, which was nice. But over time, I started noticing something strange about him. It was like he didn't know when to stop. We all enjoyed drinking, but Shad? He always took it too far. He'd get too drunk, too loud, and then something in his eyes would change. It was subtle at first. Just a glance that lingered a little too long, or the way he'd get too close to either me or Kelsey. He'd slur his words and act a little too touchy. We'd laugh it off, though. It was just Shad being Shad, right? He was Kelsey's boyfriend, after all, and I didn't want to be that person who made things weird. Then, of course, the inevitable happened. Shad moved in with Kelsey. At first, it was supposed to be temporary. Just a couple of weeks, Kelsey said. His lease was up, and he needed somewhere to stay while he figured things out. I didn't think much of it at the time. I knew right away something wasn't right. The way he started talking about fixing things around the apartment, it wasn't just about staying for a few weeks like Kelsey said. He was already planning on making it his permanent place. I didn't feel like I had a right to say anything, though. Kelsey seemed happy, and I didn't want to ruin that for her. But deep down, I had a feeling things were about to change, and not in a good way. At first, everything seemed normal. We still went out together, drank too much, and ended up back at Kelsey's place, just like before. We'd crash anywhere, on the couch, the floor, wherever. But over time, Shad's presence started to feel heavier. He was always there, always just a little too close. And when Kelsey wasn't around, he started acting different. He'd look at me in a way that sent chills down my spine. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it. He was Kelsey's boyfriend, right? He wouldn't do anything weird. I was probably just being paranoid. But then, one night, everything changed. We had our usual night out, Kelsey, Shad, and me. We pre-gamed at Kelsey's place, then hit up a few bars like we always did. Kelsey was in a great mood, flirting with Shad, and I was just trying to keep up with them. We were all pretty drunk, but nothing crazy. After a while, we decided to head back to her place. I wasn't planning on staying the night. I was just going to hang out for a bit and then head home. When we got back, Kelsey was the first to pass out. She just flopped on the couch, mid-sentence, and drifted off. I laughed because it was so typical of her to tap out early after a night of drinking, but Shad and I weren't ready to call it a night. He asked me if I wanted another drink, and even though I hesitated, I thought, why not? I was still feeling good, so I figured one more wouldn't hurt. He disappeared into the kitchen and came back with beers and 2 shots. We toasted, downed the shots, and then I flopped back on the couch to finish watching the movie. The next thing I remember, it was dark. 1 minute, I was watching the screen, and the next, I was out cold. I woke up to this strange feeling. My head was foggy, my mouth felt dry, and for a second I had no idea where I was. Then I heard a soft sound, someone moving around in the dark. I blinked, trying to shake off the fog in my brain, and my eyes slowly adjusted to the faint glow from the TV. And that's when I saw him. Shad was crouched at the end of the couch, his face just inches from my feet. At first, I thought I was dreaming, still half asleep, my mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. His phone. He was holding it up and snapping pictures of my feet. I froze. My heart started to pound. What was he doing? What was going on? I couldn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. What the hell was he doing? I wanted to scream, kick him, do something, but my body felt heavy, like I was stuck in quicksand. I tried to sit up, but before I could even move, I saw him put down his phone and then he leaned in. His tongue flicked out and, without warning, he licked the tip of my toe. I snapped back, finally breaking free from the weird freeze that had held me down. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled, my voice sharp with anger and panic. Shad jumped back, his eyes wide, looking like a caught child. Whoa, relax," he stammered. "It's not a big deal. I wasn't doing anything. Don't freak out." "Not a big deal?" My hands were shaking so much I almost couldn't stand up, but I did. My body was trembling from adrenaline now. "You were taking pictures of me and licking my feet, you freak." He stood up, towering over me. His face was a weird mix of embarrassment and anger. "I wasn't doing anything. You're overreacting. Just sit down, okay? I didn't mean anything by it." I couldn't be in that room with him for another second. I grabbed my purse, bolted for the door, and my hands were shaking so badly that I almost couldn't even get the lock turned. Behind me, I could hear him mumbling, trying to calm me down, but I wasn't listening. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I fumbled for my phone and called an Uber. I couldn't trust myself to walk home alone, not after that. My heart was still racing and I couldn't shake the feeling of his disgusting touch. When I finally got home, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the memory of his face and his phone, like it was burned into my mind. The next morning I called Kelsey. I didn't want to tell her over the phone, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. She needed to know the truth about her boyfriend. When I finally told her what happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Kelsey?" My voice was tight, like I was choking on the words. I don't know what to say," she said finally, her voice small, shaky. "I mean, that's disgusting, but I'm not totally surprised." "What do you mean?" I was confused and a bit hurt. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "He's done stuff like that to me before. I've woken up to him touching me while I was asleep. Once, I caught him taking pictures of me. He said it was a joke, that I was overreacting. I guess I just thought maybe I was being dramatic." "Kelsey, you have to break up with him," I said, almost pleading. "That's not normal. He's a creep." She agreed. The next day, Shad was gone. He didn't take it well, of course, but eventually, he left. It didn't feel like a win, though. Not really. After that, Kelsey and I went back to hanging out, just the two of us. We never spoke about Shad again, but we made a pact that we would stay away from any guy who gave us even the slightest bad vibe. Still, sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I can almost feel that cold, wet sensation on my toes. I see his face again, lit up by his phone in the dark. And no matter how hard I try to shake it, I can't help but feel like he's doing the same thing to some other girl, somewhere out there. I've got a weird and creepy story about a guy I used to know. We weren't exactly best friends, but we hung out enough that it felt like we were. I was in college back then, and I'd run into him at parties. His name was Nick, and he always seemed like a fun guy to be around, We'd laugh, drink, and just have a good time, but we never really spent much time together outside of those parties. At that time, I was living with 3 roommates in this old house we rented. It was a cheap deal because we split the rent 4 ways. In 2006, we were each paying just $350 a month, which wasn't bad at all, even for back then. The house itself, though, was a wreck. The floors were constantly creaky, and no matter how much we cleaned, it was always filthy. It got so bad that we just kept our shoes on all the time. The place was close enough to campus that we didn't mind, but the condition wasn't great. One night, my roommates and I were at a bar, and Nick showed up. After some talking and catching up, he mentioned he needed a place to crash. He had been living alone in an apartment, but it was too expensive, and he couldn't keep up with the rent anymore. He was basically stuck, needing to move out fast. As we were walking home, my roommate Sean and I were talking, and he casually brought up the idea of letting Nick stay at our place. We had a spare room that was really more of a large closet next to the living room. It was tiny, barely big enough for a bed. But Sean thought it would be fun to have Nick move in, and honestly, I agreed. After some back and forth, we decided to offer him the space. He came over the next day to check it out. We'd cleared it out, and once the junk was gone, it looked way bigger than we expected. It had a light and a plug, but no window. Nick looked at it for a second and said, "Yeah, I'll take it." He probably didn't have a choice, but whatever. He moved in almost immediately. At first, everything seemed fine. Having Nick around saved us some cash, and it was kind of nice to have another guy in the house. He was easygoing, and we got along well. We'd hang out, watch movies, and cook dinner together in the evenings. Things felt normal. Too normal. At first, things seemed normal. Nick was fitting in fine, and we were all getting along. But there was one thing about him that stood out. He smoked a lot, and I'm not talking about regular cigarettes. Back then, smoking was still pretty common in college, and one of my other roommates smoked too, so we didn't think much of it. But Nick was constantly smoking, like, always. It got to the point where I wondered how he was even paying for it. I don't know how anyone could afford that much, especially living on a student budget. A few weeks passed, and nothing strange really happened, until one afternoon. I had just gotten back from an early class and walked up to the front door of our house. I noticed the mail had come in, which wasn't unusual. It was mostly junk, but I'd sometimes find coupons or bills that I needed. So, I grabbed the pile and walked inside. I sat on the couch and spread the mail out in front of me. I was sorting through it when something caught my eye. An envelope with my name on it, from Capital One. At first, I thought it was just some marketing mail trying to get me to apply for a credit card. But when I opened it, there was an actual card inside, my name printed on it. I stared at it for a second, not sure what to make of it. I thought it must be a mistake, so I called Capital One. After what felt like forever on hold, someone finally picked up. They told me I had applied for the card, but I didn't remember doing that at all. They also said I could cancel it if I wanted. Still confused, I decided to go ahead and cancel it. But that moment was when I first started to suspect something wasn't right. I sat there for a few minutes, thinking about how it could have happened. Then it hit me. Nick had access to everything. He could have easily gone through my stuff when I wasn't home, copied down any important information, and used it to apply for that card. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, though, so I tried to stay calm. I talked to one of my other roommates about it, but I was the only one who had gotten a random credit card in the mail. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Nick had something to do with it. Over the next few days, other things started going missing around the house. Sean, my other roommate, swore some cash had disappeared from his room. At that point, we were all starting to get suspicious of Nick, especially since all this weird stuff was happening so soon after he moved in. When Nick came home that evening, we decided to confront him. We gathered in the living room, and as soon as I started accusing him, he completely flipped out. He got really angry and started shouting. I was sitting on the couch and he stormed over, standing right over me. He told me to get up, but I knew if I did, it was going to escalate into a full-on fight. I didn't want that, so I stayed seated, but he didn't care. He leaned down, grabbed my shirt, and tried to yank me up. Things got physical fast. Nick yanked me by the shirt so hard, I thought he was going to rip it off. Before he could do more, one of my roommates, Andrew, pulled him back. That's when Nick snapped and swung a punch at him. As soon as that happened, the rest of us jumped in. We all managed to bring him down to the floor and hold him there for a bit, just trying to keep him under control. Eventually, we let him up, but he didn't try to get violent again. We all helped him out the door, and I thought that was the end of it. I was nervous he might come back and trash the place, but to my surprise, he didn't show up that night. I don't know where he went, but I was relieved. The thing that kept me on edge was that he still had a key to the house. For the next few days, we didn't hear from him at all. Not at school, not at the house, nothing. But then, one night, around 3 a.m., I was lying in bed, struggling to sleep. That's when I heard the front door creak open. I immediately knew it was Nick. There was just no mistaking it. The sound of footsteps on the stairs confirmed it. My heart started pounding as the door to my room suddenly slammed open. And there he was, walking right toward me. He didn't even say anything. He just grabbed my shoulder and yanked me out of bed, throwing me to the floor. I was still awake enough to scream, and it wasn't long before two of my roommates rushed in. They managed to tackle him and pin him down again. This time, I didn't waste any time. I called the cops. Looking back, I wish we'd done that the first time, but we didn't think things would get so bad. The cops arrived quickly, and I explained everything to them, including the credit card situation. They didn't handle fraud cases themselves, but they gave me a number for the financial crimes unit. Apparently, credit card fraud is a bigger deal than I thought, and when I called them, they were able to track down how Nick had applied for the card. They didn't give me the details, but somehow, they traced it to him. At least we finally had solid proof, but that still wasn't the end of it. We still had to clean out Nick's room. When we were clearing out his stuff, I found a small plastic box on the floor. It was clear blue, kind of cheap looking. I opened it, and inside, I found several used needles along with other drug paraphernalia. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I don't know why I didn't suspect it before, but that box made it all click. Nick wasn't just a thief, he was into something much worse. Nick ended up spending some time in jail. After he got out, he stayed away from us, and we never heard from him again. By the time the semester ended, he had dropped out of school. I think he left town entirely after that. This happened a few years ago, when I was living in a small 2-bedroom apartment. It wasn't much, but it was all I could afford at the time. I had a roommate named Dave. He was around my age, maybe a bit younger, and a total slob. I didn't really expect much from the guy, but it didn't take long for me to notice how bad things were. The dishes were constantly piling up in the sink, and he never cleaned anything. The guy didn't even seem to care about anything. It wasn't that he was outright rude, just distant. Like, whenever I'd walk into the living room or kitchen, he would just walk away without saying anything. I wasn't trying to be best friends with him or anything, but some basic conversation would have been nice, you know? At the very least, we could have had some small talk, but he wasn't interested. He'd respond to me with one-word answers, or not respond at all, and that was it. Anyway, after a few months, one day I was home alone when the smoke detector in the hallway started beeping. It was that annoying sound that means the battery's low. I was busy with other things, so I ignored it for a while, but it got so bad that I couldn't focus on anything else. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen, dragged it into the hallway, and started messing with the smoke detector. It was right next to Dave's room, so I had to stand there, stretching to reach it. I was almost done changing the battery when it slipped out of my hands and fell onto the floor, rolling right into Dave's room. His door was barely open, so I pushed it a little further to get the battery. When I did, I couldn't help but look inside. I'd never been in his room before. I never really thought about it, but seeing the inside of his space felt strange. His room was exactly what I expected. Messy as hell. But there was something that caught my attention. By the corner of his closet, I saw a pair of sneakers. They were the exact same ones I owned, my nicer pair that I hadn't worn in weeks. I kept them in my closet, tucked away. I had never seen Dave wear them. They were also spotless, like they'd never been used. I couldn't help but think, what the hell? I felt this tight feeling in my chest and rushed to my room. I tore open my closet door and, sure enough, my sneakers were gone. I couldn't understand why Dave would have my shoes in his room. He would have had to go into my closet to get them. My mind was racing. I went back into his room, this time walking all the way in. I went straight to his closet, and when I opened it, I found more of my stuff. A sweatshirt, a hat, a book, even a pair of headphones I had been looking for. Some of these things I had been wondering about for weeks. Other items I hadn't even realized were missing. I kept searching, and it wasn't long before I found a few more things that were definitely mine. This whole thing felt off. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like I was being watched, or maybe just trapped in some kind of weird situation. I grabbed all my stuff and made sure to put everything back where it was supposed to be in his room. I didn't want to leave any sign that I'd been in there, just in case. That night, Dave came home around 9 p.m. I didn't think much of it at first, but within minutes of him walking into his room, he came back out and asked me if I had been in there. I was shocked. How did he know? The only way he could have known was if he saw that I'd taken my stuff back. I told him what happened, how I'd dropped a battery, and it rolled into his room, and when I went to grab it, I found all my things. I asked him straight up why he took my stuff, and to my surprise, he flat out denied it. He said he hadn't touched anything of mine, then stormed off, slamming his door behind him. I didn't see him for the rest of the night. The whole situation felt weird, but I tried to shake it off. The next day, I had to go to work, so I left early. I didn't see Dave at all that morning, but when I got back in the afternoon, everything in the apartment was trashed. The place was a mess, things thrown everywhere, as if someone had ransacked the whole apartment. My room was especially bad, like a tornado had ripped through it. I went straight to Dave's room, knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, but still nothing, so I opened it. That's when I saw it. His room was empty. There was no sign of Dave at all. His bed was untouched, his clothes were gone, and everything in the room was completely bare. But the weirdest part? His keys were nowhere to be found. He couldn't have left without them. It was like he'd just vanished. I freaked out. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I called up a friend who lived a few miles away and asked if I could crash there for a couple of days. I didn't feel safe at all. The whole place felt wrong. I ended up moving out the next week. I don't know what happened to Dave or if he even came back. But honestly, I hope I never see him again. I have no idea what kind of person he really was, but something tells me it's better not to find out. Back when I was in college, I shared an apartment with two of my best friends. We were always hanging out, laughing, and having a blast. I really wished we could keep living together after we graduated, but life had other plans. We ended up going in different directions. I got a job in the same city, but my roommates both moved away. With just me left, I couldn't afford the rent on my own, so I had no choice but to find somewhere new. I figured it would be easier to move than to deal with finding two new roommates. For about a month before our lease ended, I spent a lot of time searching online for rooms to rent. A few places looked good at first, but nothing stood out. I couldn't afford to rent a whole apartment by myself, so I was hoping to find at least one roommate to share costs with. I kept telling myself that maybe I could find someone cool, someone who might even become a friend. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. One day I came across a Craigslist ad that seemed like a decent option. It was a house being shared with the owner, a guy named Greg. From his picture, he looked like he was in his early 30s, so we had a bit of an age gap. At the time, I was 23. But it wasn't a huge deal. The house was only about 10 minutes from my job, which was perfect. Plus, the rent was cheaper than most places I'd found. The best part? The lease was month to month. No long-term commitment. It sounded pretty good, so I gave him a call and set up a meeting. When I saw the house, it wasn't much different from the photos. It was a pretty basic 3-bedroom house with a basement that wasn't finished. It was made of red brick, and the neighborhood felt a bit rough around the edges. Many of the houses nearby looked pretty worn out, but Greg's place was one of the better maintained ones. One of the rooms was set up as an office, so it would just be the two of us living there. I didn't waste time and agreed to take the room. I paid the first and last month's rent right then and there. I still had about 2 weeks left at my old apartment, so I slowly started moving my things into the new place. The first few days after I moved in were fine. Greg seemed like a decent guy. He showed me around the house and even helped me unpack some of my stuff. My room wasn't very big, but it was okay. It faced the front of the house, right across from the neighbor's place, so the view wasn't much, just a brick wall. Greg had put in a heavy door with a solid lock, which I appreciated. At first, things felt pretty normal. I thought everything would work out just fine. But then, things started getting strange. At first, I didn't think much of it. The heavy door lock gave me a sense of security. But I guess that didn't matter in the end. A few weeks into living there, something felt off. Like I mentioned, Greg seemed okay. But when I met his friends, I started to feel uneasy. One Friday night, he invited a group over, and things quickly got out of hand. I was out late with my own friends, but when I came back to the house, there were about 5 or 6 guys hanging out in the living room. They were smoking, drinking, and I'm pretty sure doing other stuff, though I didn't catch everything. I don't think any of them even noticed me walk in. They were completely spaced out. Now, I'm no saint. I've had my share of nights out. But these guys were acting like they were on something stronger. It was super uncomfortable. I'd expected to come home to a quiet house, but instead, it felt like I was walking into a party I didn't want to be a part of. I didn't say anything, just went straight to my room. Later that night, though, I started feeling strange. When I went into my room, something didn't feel right. It was like someone had been in there. My laptop was on my desk, not on my bed like I'd left it. And when I opened it up, I was shocked to find it already on. I always made sure to turn it off before leaving. I'd locked my door, so there was no way anyone could have gotten in, right? I tried to brush it off and went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next few days, I became a little distant from Greg. I didn't want to be rude, but I couldn't ignore how weird things were starting to feel. His friends were strange, and I was getting paranoid. I kept thinking back to that night. Was I just imagining things? Or had someone been in my room while I was gone? I didn't have any answers, but the gut feeling that something wasn't right stayed with me. The following weekend, Greg's friends came over again, and I made the decision to stay in. I didn't want to deal with whatever mess they were causing. I stayed locked in my room, barely even leaving it. I went to bed around 11 p.m., but I couldn't sleep. I just lay there, listening to their voices coming through the walls. By 1 a.m., I was still awake. The muffled sounds of their conversation barely audible now. It seemed like they were trying to keep it down, maybe out of respect, but it didn't make me feel any better. Then it happened. I heard someone get up and walk toward my door. My heart started pounding. They stopped right outside it. I froze, not knowing what to expect. I'd locked my door like usual, but the silence was terrifying. Suddenly, I saw the shadow of feet through the crack at the bottom of my door. And then, the door handle started to jiggle. At first, I thought maybe they were just messing around, but the longer it went on, the more my anxiety built. Whoever it was wasn't giving up. After a few moments, I heard something that still haunts me. The unmistakable sound of a key sliding into the lock. The click of the lock turning felt like a punch to the gut. And then, the door creaked open. I shot out of bed, panic flooding me. "What the hell?" I shouted, my voice shaking. I bolted over to my door and slammed it shut. Then I locked it again, pressing my back up against it, just shaking. I dropped down to the floor, still in a panic, and yelled that I was calling the cops. Greg tried to calm me down, coming up with some nonsense explanation. He said his friends were just worried about me and wanted to make sure I was okay. But I didn't buy it for a second. That guy had a spare key to my room the whole time. Who knows what he'd been doing in there when I wasn't around? I wasn't going back to bed that night. I had no choice but to stay in that room, locked in, too scared to sleep. I spent the whole night sitting up against the door, barely able to breathe from the anxiety. When morning finally came, I immediately called one of my old friends from school. He lived on the other side of town, but he said I could crash with him until I figured out what to do. I started packing the moment the sun was up, and by noon, I was out of there. Just as I was about to leave, Greg tried one last time to talk me out of calling the cops. I was still shaken, but I told him I wasn't going to report him, even though I knew that was what I should have done. I just needed to get out of that house, away from him, as fast as I could. Later that day, I did end up calling the police. They interviewed Greg, but of course, it was my word against his. Nothing came of it. He walked away scot-free. I couldn't stop thinking about what had actually happened that night. The whole situation didn't make sense. I didn't have anything valuable in my room, just some old textbooks and a few clothes. I just graduated, so I was pretty broke. Greg knew that too, since he had helped me move in and unpack. So why would he go into my room in the first place? It wasn't until a few days later that I figured out what was really going on. I was casually browsing my computer when something strange popped up in my browser. I looked through my browsing history and saw a credit card application that I definitely didn't remember filling out. My heart sank. I was pretty sure it was Greg, or maybe one of his friends. How he got my computer password, I still don't know for sure. My guess is that he'd peered over my shoulder while I was typing it in, or maybe he was snooping around when I wasn't home. I also started wondering if there were hidden cameras in my room. Honestly, I wouldn't put anything past him. The fact that he had a spare key to my room was bad enough. When I dug a little deeper, I found 2 more credit card applications. I immediately canceled everything and reported it to the police. But once again, it was just my word against theirs, and they didn't do anything about it. It felt like I'd been violated, but nothing could be done. He got away with it, and I was left feeling completely powerless. This might get a little complicated, but bear with me. I'm going to share what happened back in 2016 when I lived with a guy named Eric. He was my roommate, and looking back now, I honestly think he might have been a serial killer, or at least on his way to becoming one. I don't know how to explain it, but everything about him felt off from the start. So, I moved in during the summer of 2016. Eric seemed pretty normal at first. He was a little strange, yeah, but who isn't? He was quiet, socially awkward, and had this sort of intensity about him. When I was signing the lease, though, he made it clear that I should never go into the basement. He was weirdly serious about it, which I found odd. I thought, okay, whatever. Maybe he's got a weird space down there he doesn't want anyone in, and didn't think much of it. I was just happy to find a cheap place to stay. But over time, I started noticing more and more things that didn't sit right with me. First off, Eric was into meth. Now, I'm not one to judge someone for their habits, but this was the first time I'd ever really been around someone who was using meth, and it was clear that he was pretty deep into it. He would work his regular job and still function somewhat normally, but when he was home, especially after using, he would start saying weird stuff. He'd joke about, if I smelled a lie coming from the basement, not to worry about it. I didn't really think much of it the first time he said it, but the more he repeated it, the more uneasy I got. One day, after he said it again, I finally asked him what he meant. He just smiled and said, I use chemicals to clean up after the bodies. He said it so casually, like it was just another thing to mention. At first, I thought he was just being creepy for laughs, but the more he said things like that, the more it started to feel like something was off. He also seemed oddly obsessed with knowing where I was and what I was doing. My work schedule, my comings and goings. He was always keeping track. One day, I took a sick day from work, and when I walked in through the front door, Eric was super freaked out. He didn't even realize I was home. His car was parked outside, but he wasn't in the house. I remember hearing a lot of banging and strange noises from the basement, like muffled yelling. I thought maybe I was just imagining things, but then the weirdest part was that his car was parked in the driveway, but he wasn't upstairs. I had another strange encounter when Eric was playing his music. Loud, thumping music that shook the whole house. It wasn't even regular music. Sometimes he'd play NPR, just talking heads blaring at full volume. It was so loud it felt like he was trying to cover up some noise from downstairs. It made me feel even more uneasy. Eric would make these casual, disturbing comments too, mostly about sex workers. One time he said, "You can do whatever you want to them, choke them, beat them to death, and nobody cares." I remember getting angry and telling him that it was disgusting. But the more he smoked meth, the more his talk would circle back to things like that. He'd go on about how he had a nice house, a good job, and because of that, no one would ever suspect him. That was when I realized that he wasn't joking. It didn't feel like a weird sense of humor anymore. At that point, I started to worry. I didn't have a lot of options financially, and I was stuck in this lease. I tried telling myself that maybe he was just going through some messed up fantasies. I was scared, though. Scared I was going to find out the truth too late. So, as things went on, I started noticing even more red flags. I knew Eric was into hiring sex workers, but honestly, I didn't think much about it at first. People have their own lives, and whatever they do, that's on them. But as time passed, I started feeling more and more uneasy about him. It was little things that kept adding up. One day, while I was doing laundry, I smelled something awful. At first, I thought maybe it was just something rotting outside, but this was different. The house we lived in was new, built just a few years before, and we were in an area of Portland that was pretty quiet. It wasn't like the houses I grew up in, back in upstate New York, where animals could sometimes crawl into the walls and die. No, this smell wasn't like that. It was the unmistakable stench of decay, and it was coming from the garage. There were no animals, no signs of anything that could have caused it. It was a smell that I couldn't ignore. I didn't know what to make of it at first, but it didn't sit well with me. So I decided to bring it up with Eric. I didn't want to seem too confrontational, so I tried to play it off as one of his weird jokes. I said something like, "You really need to clean up the bodies better, man. I can smell the rot from the garage." I wasn't expecting the look he gave me. His eyes went wide, and his face twisted into this mix of fear and anger. He fumbled for words before finally muttering, "What? Really?" I just nodded and said, "Yeah, really." There was this long, awkward silence before he finally said, "Thanks for letting me know," and just walked off to his room. I don't know why, but the way he reacted made my stomach drop. A few days after that, something else happened. I was doing laundry again when Eric called out to me from the garage. He was in the upper crawl space, and he sounded almost too eager, like he was trying to get me to come up there. Something in me froze. My gut told me that if I went up there, I wasn't coming back down. I just made up some excuse, grabbed my laundry, tossed it in my room, and left. I still don't know why, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there as fast as I could. Things didn't get any better. Over the next couple of months, Eric's behavior kept getting worse. His comments about women and sex workers became more graphic, more disturbing. He'd go on and on about violence, about things that made my skin crawl. And then he started using more meth. It was clear he was spiraling. One night, he showed me something on his phone. It was a video he'd made. I can't even fully describe it. It was this messed up scene with bondage, screaming noises, and a figure dressed in a plague doctor costume. It was like he was trying to make some kind of twisted art. If I'd seen any one of these things on their own, I might have brushed them off, but all of it together, it was impossible to ignore. I should have done something sooner. I should have gone into that basement or that crawl space. Maybe I would have seen something I could have reported. Or maybe I would have been able to get out of there before things escalated further. But I was too scared. And by the time I realized what was really going on, I didn't know how to get out without drawing attention. Looking back now, I wish I'd done more. The signs were there, but I didn't connect the dots until it was almost too late. I have no idea what he might have been doing in that basement, in that crawl space. But I'm pretty sure whatever it wasn't good. It was around October 2017 when I finally decided to leave. I packed up and left for a protest at a Native American reservation. Something to get me out of the house and away from Eric. It wasn't just about protesting anymore, though. I was desperate to get out of there, to leave whatever was happening in that house behind. I told Eric I was moving out, and I could see he wasn't happy, but he didn't try to stop me. That last night, he was drinking and using again. He started talking, and it was the same old disturbing stuff. He went on about violence and murder like it was a joke, but there was nothing funny about it. At one point, I finally said, "You know they're going to catch you eventually." I wasn't holding back anymore. I had no choice but to say something. He just stared at me for a second before responding in this cold, flat tone. "I'm the last person they'd ever suspect," he said, like he'd thought about it a lot. "They'll never catch me." It wasn't a joke anymore. It was like he was giving me a warning. The way he said it, so calm and certain, made my blood run cold. I don't think I slept that night. The next morning, I left. I packed my stuff, went out the door, and never looked back. But even though I was gone, that feeling of unease stuck with me for months, then a year, then a year and a half. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering if I had done enough or if I had just walked away and done nothing. The guilt ate at me. I felt like I owed it to myself, and to whoever might be in danger, to at least try to do something. So, about a year and a half later, I called Portland Crime Stoppers. I stayed anonymous, but I gave them all the details I could remember. His car, the house, the things he had said. They put me on hold for what felt like forever, and when they came back, they were asking me for even more specific details. It seemed like they were really interested, and that gave me a tiny bit of relief. I left the tip and hung up, hoping it might lead somewhere. At least I had tried, right? Not long ago, I decided to tell my mom everything. She listened closely, asking me questions and getting more and more invested in it. Eventually, she pulled up the address on Google Maps and switched to Street View. That's when I saw it. There was a large trailer sitting in the driveway, one that wasn't there when I lived there. I don't know what it means, but I can't stop thinking about it. It could be anything, I guess. But why would it suddenly be there now? My mind is racing with theories, but I can't come up with a solid reason for it. Honestly, I don't know if I'll ever get closure. I don't know if my suspicions will ever be confirmed unless Eric gets caught, but I don't want to go back there to find out. I've met a lot of shady people in my life, but none of them have ever made me feel the way he did. It's like something in me knew deep down that I had to get away, and I'm glad I did. But every now and then, I wonder what happened after I left, and if those red flags ever led to something darker. I hope I never have to find out. A few years ago, I found myself in what seemed like the perfect situation. I had been living in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment with a couple whose relationship was basically falling apart. The atmosphere between them was awful, like a constant storm hanging over us. Every day was filled with their yelling, slammed doors, and things being thrown around. I couldn't get a moment of peace, and sleep was almost impossible. It felt like I was trapped in a bad reality TV show. The tension in that place was unbearable, and I was losing my sanity, slowly but surely. I knew I had to get out before I completely snapped. Then, out of the blue, I got a message from Reese, one of my childhood friends. We hadn't been in touch much in recent years. Life just kind of took us down different paths. But when we started talking again, it felt like no time had passed. Reese had found a new house, a big one, and needed a roommate. Since I was desperate to leave my situation, he offered me a way out. The deal was simple. He needed someone to help pay the rent and, more importantly, co-sign on the lease. It sounded like the break I needed. Reese was easygoing and chill, someone I trusted completely. The thought of living with him in a big, nice house was like a dream after the nightmare I'd been through. Without even thinking about it, I said, "I'm in." Within days, we were both moving into the new place. It was everything I could have hoped for. A 2-story house with tons of room, right in the center of the city. The living room had this huge fireplace that just made the place feel cozy. The kitchen was brand new, and the backyard had enough space for a fire pit. Plus, there was a garage where I could finally work on my car, something I hadn't been able to do in years. The neighborhood was quiet, but close to everything. Bars, restaurants, even a park. Reese and I each had our own rooms, and there was more than enough space for us to relax without stepping on each other's toes. The first few weeks felt like paradise. Reese and I slipped back into our old, comfortable friendship. Most nights we'd watch movies or play video games together. On weekends, we'd either hit up the local bars or just stay home, get drunk, and talk about the good old days. The house felt like our safe haven, our little world that we had created. After everything I'd gone through, it was exactly what I needed. But then, things started to change. It was so subtle at first that I barely noticed it. It started with Reese staying out later than usual, sometimes not getting home until after midnight. Normally, he'd be back by 9 or 10, but now, he'd come in smelling like beer and cigarettes. At first, I didn't say anything. He was being quiet about it, so I figured maybe he was just out having fun. We both had our own lives after all. But as the days went on, the weirdness started to build up. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. But soon, it became a regular thing. Reese started disappearing more and more, not just on weekends, but during the week too. There were days I wouldn't see him at all, except for when he came home late at night, stumbling into his room without a word. It felt like he was avoiding me, or at least avoiding spending time at home. After a while, I couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, when we were both home for once, I decided to ask him about it. We were sitting in the living room, beers in hand, Reese glued to his phone while I flipped through the TV channels, trying to relax. "You've been out a lot lately, man," I said casually, keeping my voice light, like it was no big deal. Reese glanced up from his phone, his face unreadable. "Yeah, I've been hanging out at a bar down the street, met some new people." I nodded, took a swig of my beer. "You been going there a lot?" He shrugged. "Yeah, it's a cool spot. Good crowd." I didn't push it. I figured maybe he was just unwinding, doing his thing. Everyone needs their own space, right? Reese wasn't really doing anything wrong. He was just having some fun. I let it slide, thinking things would go back to normal. But they didn't. They only got worse. Reese started coming home later and later, and when he did, he was usually trashed. He'd stumble into the house, barely able to keep his balance, then crash in his room without a word. Sometimes I'd hear him puking in the bathroom in the middle of the night or knocking into stuff as he tried to make his way back to his bed. It was starting to annoy me, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who couldn't handle a little partying. Then came that Friday night. I remember every detail like it was yesterday. I had worked late, staying at the office to finish up a big project. By the time I finally left, it was already dark outside, and I was exhausted. All I wanted was to get home, crack open a beer, and zone out in front of the TV. But as soon as I turned onto our street, something felt off. There were cars everywhere. Both sides of the road were completely lined with parked cars. Now, our neighborhood was usually pretty quiet. People mostly parked in their driveways, so seeing so many cars on the street made me uneasy. I pulled closer to our house, and my stomach sank. The driveway was completely packed, with no space for me to park. There were people standing around the front yard, chatting and laughing. Music was blaring from inside the house, so loud I could feel the bass vibrating in the air even from where I was sitting in my car. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. I had no choice but to park a couple of blocks away and walk back to the house. The closer I got, the clearer it became. There was a full-blown party going on inside our house. I hadn't heard a single thing about it. People were hanging out on the porch, beers in hand, while others leaned against the cars in the driveway, smoking and laughing. The music was getting louder now, thumping from inside, mixing with the noise of shouting and more laughter. I stood at the edge of the yard for a second, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. There had to be at least 50 people crowding the house and the yard. My stomach churned with a sinking feeling. Something was off. This wasn't Reese. This wasn't how he acted. I hadn't been told a thing about a party. Not a word. I pushed through the crowd, ignoring the confused looks from strangers, and made my way to the front door. The moment I stepped inside, The noise hit me like a brick wall. The living room was packed. People everywhere, empty beer cans and red Solo cups scattered all over the place. Someone had plugged in their phone and was blasting music so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. The house was a disaster. Drinks spilled on the floor, the carpet stained, furniture shoved out of the way to create a space for dancing. I froze for a second at the door, a wave of panic washing over me. What the hell was going on? This wasn't like Reese at all. I tried to shake it off and began moving through the house, looking for him. He wasn't in the living room nor the kitchen, where a group of guys were playing beer pong on the dining table. I pushed through to the backyard, hoping to find him there. And then I saw him. Reese was leaning against the grill, holding a bottle of whiskey. He was out of it, eyes half closed, barely standing as he swayed a bit, staring blankly at the flames. "Reese!" I yelled, trying to get his attention over the noise. I pushed past a few people and walked toward him. "Dude, what the hell is going on?" He blinked slowly, then looked at me, his eyes glassy. "Party, man," he slurred, lifting the bottle of whiskey like that explained everything. I just stared at him. "A party? There's 50 people in here, dude. You didn't say a word to me about this." Reese just shrugged and took another swig from the bottle. Didn't think I needed to. Before I could say anything else, two huge guys walked up behind us. They were both easily over 6 feet tall, their muscles like something out of a gym bro's dream. One of them gave me a quick glance before turning his attention to Reese. "Everything good here?" he asked, his voice calm but with a sharp edge that made my skin crawl. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold sweat running down my back. No. Everything's not good," I said, my voice shaking just a little. The bigger guy didn't move, just kept staring at me with this weird, unsettling look. The tension was thick, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something was off. Something wasn't right about this whole situation. "This is my house too, and I never agreed to this," I snapped, trying to keep my voice steady. The bigger of the two guys stepped forward, his face hardening as he glared at me. "Reese's name is on the lease too, right?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "If he says it's cool, then it's cool. You got a problem with that?" I could feel my hands trembling, and my chest tightened with anger. But I knew better than to go off right then. These guys weren't here for the party. They were here to intimidate. If I fought back, I knew it would only make things worse. I had to pick my battles, and this one wasn't worth it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep calm. "No problem," I muttered, turning away before things could escalate further. The rest of the night, I locked myself in my room, the door shut tight. I could hear everything going on outside, people shouting, music blaring, bottles crashing to the ground. It was a blur of noise, and I felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't sleep, not with the sounds of my house being torn apart just outside my door. How could I? This wasn't just a party. It was destruction happening right under my nose, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. When the sun finally came up, I dragged myself out of bed. The house was a wreck. I went downstairs, my body heavy with exhaustion. The furniture was flipped over, beer stains soaked into the carpet, and I could see that a few of our more expensive things were gone, probably taken by some of the random partygoers. Reese was passed out on the couch, snoring loudly, completely unaware of the mess around him. I stood there for a while, staring at the destruction. The anger I'd felt the night before had disappeared, replaced by this overwhelming sense of defeat. How had things gotten this bad? I didn't even recognize Reese anymore. He wasn't the guy I grew up with. Something had changed in him, and it wasn't just the partying. There was something darker underneath, something I didn't fully understand. But at that moment, I knew I couldn't stay. I wasn't about to watch my life crumble any further. The next week, I started looking for a new place. I didn't even bother telling Reese. I just packed up my stuff, leaving everything behind. I left the key on the kitchen counter and walked out without a word. I never saw him again after that. So, I'm 26 now, but this happened when I was 21. during my first year of college. I'm not sure if it's the same everywhere, but at my school, they match you with a random roommate when you apply for dorms. You fill out a form, and they say it's to find someone you're compatible with, but honestly, I think it's more about convenience. I was a bit older than most of the other first-year students because I took a few years off before starting college. I was 21 when I moved in, which made me a little different from the usual 18-year-olds. My roommate, his name was Jake, and he had this whole punk rock vibe going on. He had spiked hair and wore band t-shirts all the time. He was also a bit older, like 22, I think. He had checked in before me, so he got the bed farther from the door. I still remember when I walked in, he stood up, we shook hands, and he seemed cool at first. But after a while, I realized we didn't really have much in common. I liked reading and playing video games, while he was all about loud music and partying. One thing that bugged me a lot was that he smoked. I could smell it the second I walked into the room. The dorm had a no-smoking rule, but it was clear he didn't care. It didn't cause any huge arguments, but it definitely created some tension between us. We weren't exactly buddies, but we got by. After a month, Jake started spending more time out of the dorm. Most weekends, he'd go out partying somewhere off campus, probably hitting some punk show or bar. I didn't know much about it, but he would leave early in the evening and sometimes wouldn't come back until really late, or even not at all. I think he only slept in our room about half the time, which, honestly, I didn't mind. It gave me more space to myself. He wasn't making any friends on our floor, but he started hanging out with some guys who weren't even students at our school. They looked like older punk rockers, probably people he'd met at concerts or whatever. These guys would come around sometimes, but it was rare, and they never stayed long. One night, though, I came back to our room around 11 p.m. and found 4 or 5 of these older guys sitting around, drinking beer. One of them was even smoking, but he was trying to blow the smoke out the window. These guys were in their 30s at least, maybe even older. I said hey, but immediately felt weird about it. They weren't doing anything wrong, but the whole vibe was just off. I stayed for maybe 5 minutes, then I decided to head to one of my friends' rooms and just hang out there until late. When I got back to the dorm around 1 a.m., the guys were gone, and Jake still hadn't come back. That was the first time something felt truly strange. The next night, Jake came back around 10 p.m. I didn't really say much to him since I was busy studying on my laptop. I did notice, though, that he looked completely out of it, like he hadn't slept in days. If I had to guess, he was probably spending a lot of his time drinking and doing whatever else. It wasn't hard to figure out, especially with the way he was acting. As the weeks went on, his group of older friends started showing up more often. I couldn't understand why he kept hanging around with them, so I just kept my distance. I spent more time in the library or hanging out with other people on my floor. One time, I overheard that Jake got in trouble for sneaking his friends into the dorm. He also got caught smoking inside, which is against the rules. It was starting to feel like he might get kicked out soon. I hate to admit it, but I kind of hoped he would. Not that I hated him, but having a roommate like that was just exhausting. There was another night when Jake and his friends were partying again in our room. I popped in for a little bit, but honestly, it didn't feel like my crowd. It wasn't anything crazy like drugs, but one of his friends gave me a really weird vibe. I didn't catch his name, but the guy had to be in his mid-30s, maybe even older, and he was huge, probably over 300 pounds. He was bald and wearing a jean vest with ripped jeans. Just looking at him made me uncomfortable. I bailed out of there around 10, like I usually did when things felt off, and went next door to my friend's room. I could still hear the noise through the walls, but it wasn't like I could do anything about it. Around midnight, I heard our RA knock on the door. She was talking to them about the noise because it was a school night. There was some arguing, but after a few minutes, I could hear them leave. I waited a bit, then went back to my room. After airing out the cigarette smoke, I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, Jake didn't show up, or the day after. It wasn't entirely unusual for him to disappear for a while, but by the 4th day, I started to get concerned. Exams were coming up, and we'd been roommates for a few months by that point. I asked around the dorm, but no one had seen him. I even tried calling him, but his phone just went straight to voicemail. That's when I started to get the feeling something wasn't right. I tried reaching out to Jake a bunch of times, sending him text messages and calling, but I never heard back. After a while, I realized it was serious, so I decided to report him as missing. I went over to campus security and told them what I knew. I felt kind of bad for not doing it sooner, but I kept thinking Jake would just show up with some dumb excuse. After I reported it, campus security had me talk to them a few times. They asked about the people he hung out with, especially the older guys. I told them everything I knew, but honestly, I didn't know much. Jake didn't have any real friends on campus, and those guys he was hanging out with were strangers to me. I never even got their names, and I had no way of contacting them. One evening, I was hanging out in the common room with a couple of friends when we saw a police car pull up outside. I watched through the window as a couple of officers walked into the building. I had this bad feeling it had something to do with Jake. Sure enough, later that night, the RA knocked on my door with the police. They started asking me all the same questions that campus security had. Stuff like when I last saw Jake and who he'd been with. I gave them the same answers, but they seemed a little too focused on me. It was like they didn't believe what I was saying, like I was hiding something. Maybe it seemed strange to them that I didn't know anything about Jake's friends. After the cops left, we all sat around talking about it. People were throwing around different ideas. Some thought maybe Jake had run away. Others wondered if something terrible had happened to him. But no one really knew anything for sure. A couple of weeks passed, and still no word from Jake. The police came by a few more times to ask more questions, but they never spoke to me again. I guess I was off their list of suspects or whatever. The police figured Jake had gotten involved with those older guys. They tracked them down eventually, but those guys didn't say anything helpful. Honestly, I think one or more of them knew something. Whether it was an accident or something more deliberate, I couldn't say, but they had to be involved somehow. The worst part was, we never got any answers. The semester ended and I finished the year without Jake around. It was like he just vanished, and nobody seemed to know why. I moved out of my parents' house when I was 19. I'd just finished high school and was eager to start fresh. I didn't want to stay in my small town any longer, so I decided to head to a bigger city. The problem was, I couldn't afford my own place, so I started searching for a roommate. I was checking Craigslist and Facebook groups every single day. One day I came across a post that seemed pretty good. It was for a room in a 2-bedroom house. The guy's name was Kyle, and he was in his late 20s. The post had 3 photos. One was of the living room, which looked nice. The couch looked big and comfy, and the whole room was decorated well. The other 2 photos were of the empty bedroom, which seemed pretty standard. Nothing too special. It was clear that I'd have to add my own touch to make it feel like home. After a few messages back and forth, we agreed that I would move in. It was a bit of a jump for me, but I was excited to get out of my hometown, and Kyle seemed okay through our chats. Since I was coming from a city far away, I didn't get to see the place before I moved in. A day or 2 before I left, Kyle sent me a list of house rules. It was basic stuff. Pick up after yourself, don't enter his room, that kind of thing. Nothing too crazy. When I arrived at the house, Kyle was there to greet me. He was tall and thin, with bad posture. He was always hunched over, and his smile was weird, almost like he wasn't used to it, which immediately made me feel uncomfortable. Once I got settled in, Kyle disappeared into his room, and I didn't see him again that day. It felt really lonely being there. I didn't know anyone except for one friend, and this city was huge and unfamiliar. Right away, I noticed something strange. The pictures on Facebook didn't really match up with what I was seeing. The living room wasn't as fancy, and the furniture looked older. But honestly, I didn't have any other choices, so I decided to let it slide. I figured Kyle probably used better pictures to make the place look more appealing. It wasn't terrible, just cheap. Most of the furniture looked like it came from thrift stores, but it didn't bother me too much. Still, something felt off about the whole place. As the days passed, Kyle pretty much stayed locked in his room. I knew he worked from home, but the silence coming from his room was weird. It didn't sound like he was working. It felt more like he was isolating himself. Sometimes I'd hear faint mumbling, like he was talking to himself, but it wasn't often. I'd spot him briefly in the kitchen now and then, but that was about it. I started to get curious about what he was doing in there all the time. He was always in his room when I left for work and always there when I came back. The more time went on, the less I saw of him. After a couple weeks, I realized I hadn't seen him for days. Not even in the kitchen, not even going to the bathroom. He just disappeared. And when I tried calling him, he wouldn't answer. I really didn't want to, but I felt like I had no choice. I needed to check on him. What if something was wrong? What if he was hurt or needed help? I had to find out. I approached his door, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what I was going to find behind it. I stood there for a second, then knocked twice, hard, on the door. I waited. There was no sound on the other side. I listened closely, but nothing. My stomach turned. I turned the doorknob, but it was locked. The kind of lock you could easily open with something thin, though. I remembered seeing a wooden skewer in the kitchen, so I grabbed that and slid it into the lock. It clicked open. I cautiously pushed the door. The room was dark. The curtains were pulled shut, and the air felt stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in a while. I looked around, and everything seemed off. His bed was made, but his desk was a mess, papers scattered everywhere. But there was no sign of him. It was like he vanished. I stood there in the doorway for a while, just staring at the empty room. After a minute, I closed the door, trying to stay calm, but my head was racing. What was I supposed to do? My roommate had disappeared without a trace. Was he a missing person? Or was he just out somewhere? I didn't call the police. It didn't feel like it was serious enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, when I was lying in bed, I heard the front door creak open. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. I froze. I listened as the footsteps came closer, heading straight toward my room. The door slammed open, and Kyle rushed into my room. Before I could even react, he was standing over my bed, pressing a knife against my neck. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he yelled. I couldn't even find my voice to answer. The knife dug harder into my skin. "Stay the hell out of my room," he barked at me. I finally managed to mumble an apology, but I couldn't see his face. It was too dark, and I could feel the anger coming off him in waves. "What did you see?" he demanded. I tried to explain. "I didn't see anything. I just opened the door and left." The words barely left my mouth before he turned around and stormed out of my room. He slammed the front door behind him as he left. I just lay there, not daring to sleep. My heart was racing, and I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly things escalated. What the hell was going on with him? The next day, Kyle was still gone. I wandered around the house, trying to shake off the feeling of what had just happened. That's when I found the camera in the kitchen, tucked behind the coffee maker. I thought it was strange, so I kept looking. Sure enough, there was another camera hidden in the hallway. That's when it hit me. He must have known I went into his room because he was watching me. There was probably a camera in his room too, maybe even linked to his phone. I knew I had to get out of there. I'd been ignoring all the warning signs, but now it was too obvious. I started packing up whatever I could, feeling more and more unsettled. I called my parents, and my mom sounded relieved when I told her I was coming home. They drove out to pick me up later that night, and we stayed in a motel on the way back. When we finally got to my parents' house, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. I had to quit my job in the city, but honestly, it didn't even matter. That experience made me realize I wasn't ready to be on my own yet. It's hard to explain, but I felt like I'd dodged something dangerous. I still wonder what Kyle was so protective of in his room. Sure, privacy is normal, but his reaction was over the top. It made me think he was hiding something serious. And the way he pulled a knife on me, that wasn't just being protective, that was unhinged. We ended up filing a police report, but we never heard anything back. It's been over 5 years now, and I still have no idea what Kyle was really up to. I didn't stick around long enough to find out. Honestly, it wasn't worth sticking around for, and I'm glad I left when I did. This happened during my second year of college, back in 2014. I can't remember the exact month, but it was probably around late winter. I was living with two of my best friends, Emily and Sarah. We had just moved out of the dorms into our first house off campus, and it felt amazing to finally have some freedom. Of course, with that freedom came a lot of experimenting, drinking, trying drugs, that sort of thing. We started hanging out with a new crowd, people who were into heavier stuff like cocaine and ecstasy. After a while, Emily and I realized we needed to slow down, especially with how it was affecting our studies and our health. So, we decided to cut back. Sarah, though, kept going, getting more and more into the party scene. She wasn't the same after that, acting a lot more reckless and aggressive. I'm not judging, but I do think it played a big role in what happened next. One weekend, we went to a party together. We ended up getting separated, and I had made plans to leave early, so I asked Sarah to walk Emily home. We had this rule where no one walked alone at night, but that night, it didn't work out. Sarah left with someone else, and Emily was stuck walking back by herself. She didn't know it at the time, but someone started following her. I'll always regret leaving the way I did, even though I've made peace with it over time. The next morning, I came back to the house, and Emily filled me in on what happened. She was really upset, which was unusual for her. Apparently, at some point, she texted Sarah to say she wasn't happy about having to walk alone. Emily was pretty blunt about it, venting her frustration. Sarah didn't respond the way we expected. We thought she'd apologize, or at least brush it off, but that didn't happen. Instead, she completely lost it. Danielle responded to Katie's text in a way I never expected. She told Emily to get over it, and to stop being so sensitive, using some very harsh words in the process. It was completely out of left field, and honestly, we both thought it was kind of weird, especially since Sarah wasn't usually like that. But we tried not to dwell on it too much. It was Monday, so Emily went off to her job on campus, and I headed to my afternoon class. While I was stuck in a lecture, Sarah showed up at Emily's workplace, which was this student rec center, and caused a huge scene. She started yelling at Emily in front of a bunch of people, more than 60, I think, just calling her every bad name you can imagine. Of course, the staff had to escort Sarah out, but somehow, she made her way back to the house. What's even more bizarre is that Sarah's mom was visiting that weekend and had been with her the whole time. From what I could tell, Sarah's mom seemed terrified of her, so she didn't step in to stop anything. When Sarah finally made it back home, I had just returned from class and was in the kitchen making something to eat. At that point, Sarah's anger seemed to be all focused on Emily. I really tried to stay out of it, thinking maybe they would just sort things out themselves. But no, Sarah found me in the kitchen and cornered me, telling me how much she hated Emily and how messed up everything was. I've never seen someone look so furious. The look in her eyes was just wild. I didn't want to fight, so I went straight to my room and just tried to calm down. That's when I heard Emily coming up the side of the house. She was on the phone with her mom, crying, telling her about what had happened at the rec center. My stomach dropped, and I knew this was about to escalate. Sure enough, the door opened, and Emily walked in, just as Sarah was storming toward her. I could hear them screaming at each other almost immediately. Emily was standing her ground, telling Sarah she had crossed a line, but Sarah wasn't having it. She started throwing even worse insults back, and before I knew it, they were both yelling at the top of their lungs. I couldn't take it anymore, so I went into the living room to try and stop it. Sarah's mom was there, just standing quietly, probably wishing she wasn't. I told Sarah to stop and leave, but she just told me to go fuck myself. That gave Emily just enough time to try to run to her room, but Sarah was right behind her. As Emily was trying to shut her bedroom door, Sarah slammed her hand in it. I froze. I didn't know what to do anymore. Things quickly spiraled out of control. I stepped out onto the front porch to try and get some space, and Emily followed me, A few moments later, we heard Sarah's mom yelling at her to put something down. We looked at each other, both feeling the same rush of fear. I told Emily to run and call 911. Just as I said that, the front door flew open, and there stood Sarah, holding a huge kitchen knife over her head, screaming at the top of her lungs that she was going to kill Emily. By this point, all of our neighbors were standing outside, watching, probably unsure what the hell was happening. I've never been the type to get involved in fights, but this was different. There was no way I was going to let Sarah hurt Emily. So, without thinking, I rushed at Sarah and somehow managed to wrestle the knife out of her hands, tossing it onto the front lawn. I started to grab it, but just then, Sarah ran back inside to get another knife. When she came back, she pointed it at herself and asked me if I wanted to watch her end it all. It was like she wasn't even the same person anymore. Her mom was freaking out, crying and begging her to stop, but all I could do was keep telling Sarah to put the knife down. And then, everything went black. When I came to, I was running down the street with Emily. We made our way to a neighbor's house, finally finding some safety. The whole time we could still hear Sarah screaming, and it sounded like it was coming from a distance, but we didn't dare look back. I don't think either of us knew what to do or how to process what had just happened. We were in shock, but we were thankful that our neighbors let us in and helped us until the police showed up. The cops arrived a little while later, along with a crisis response team. They took Sarah away and drove her to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. After that, Emily and I stayed with some friends for a couple of weeks, not feeling ready to go back to the house. Eventually, we returned, but it wasn't the same. We moved out at the end of the year, not wanting to stay there after everything that had gone down. The memories were just too much. Later, I found out that Sarah had had some kind of mental breakdown, triggered by stress, drugs, and maybe something deeper that no one knew about. It really opened my eyes to the importance of mental health, especially in young adults, and how quickly things can spiral out of control. It also taught me to trust my instincts more. I had felt something off about Sarah for a while, but I ignored those feelings, thinking I was just overthinking things. Looking back, I wish I had paid attention. It's been a couple of years, but every now and then, I still think about that place. Not like you remember an old apartment or a place you stayed for a few months, but more like something that sticks with you, like a nightmare that never really leaves. At the time, I was at one of the lowest points of my life. I had just gone through a brutal breakup with my girlfriend. The breakup itself wasn't just between the two of us. It was a whole thing where everyone we knew had to pick sides. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It felt like half of my social circle was splitting up too. And of course, most of our mutual friends sided with her. I wasn't exactly in the best shape mentally, and I wasn't the most fun person to be around. So I had to move out of the apartment we shared. The lease was up, and honestly, I wasn't in the mood to stick around and keep dealing with the drama. The issue, though, was that most of my friends had full places or weren't really eager to let me crash with them, especially since I was carrying a lot of emotional baggage. That's when I ended up turning to the internet. I didn't have many options left, and it felt like I was taking a huge risk, but I was desperate. I browsed through some listings, but most were either way too expensive or felt off in some way. Then I found one that seemed perfect. A guy named Mason was renting out a room in his house. The price seemed almost unreal, the location was great, and the house, judging by the pictures, looked nice. This was around 2018, and back then, it was common to find places through Craigslist or social media. There were still some decent options if you dug around. I thought, why not? What did I have to lose? So I jotted down his contact info and reached out. Mason responded almost immediately, which was a little unusual, but I figured it was a good sign. We set up a time for me to come by and check out the place. When I showed up, the situation felt strangely formal. He said he wanted to do a quick interview, nothing too serious, but enough to make sure we'd be a good fit. Honestly, I didn't care. I just needed to get out of my ex's place. So, later that week, I drove over to Mason's house, nervous but hopeful. I was actually kind of excited about living with an older guy, someone like an uncle, who might have some life experience to share. Maybe we could hang out or even find some common interests. The house itself was nicer than I expected. It was a two-story place in a quiet neighborhood, a little off the main road, with a perfect lawn and a front porch that looked like it belonged in a home improvement magazine. When Mason answered the door, it felt like he had been standing right behind it, waiting for me. He was tall, thin, and had this pale, almost waxy look to him. His brown hair was short, but looked like it hadn't been combed in years. His smile was too wide, and his handshake was a little too firm. He seemed friendly enough, just a little intense, but I thought I could deal with that. There was something off about him, though, something I couldn't quite figure out. He showed me around the house, and I couldn't help but be impressed. The room was small but cozy, plenty of natural light, and a view of the backyard. Everything in the house was spotless, almost unnaturally so. It felt like Mason spent every waking moment making sure every inch of the place was perfect. A couple of days later, I officially moved in. At first, everything seemed great. Mason was quiet, and I had my own space again. He'd come and go, usually early in the morning heading to work or church, and sometimes I'd see him in the evenings. We didn't really talk much, just a quick hello or good night. Nothing deeper than that. But there was something about Mason that didn't sit quite right. As we got to know each other, he mentioned that he had inherited a lot of money a few years ago. He didn't have to work full-time anymore, just a part-time job at an engineering firm. The rest of the time, he volunteered at his church. The way he talked about it, like it was the center of his world, kind of made me uncomfortable. But who was I to judge? At the time, I wasn't looking to make a big deal out of it. I was just happy to be out of my ex's place. Still, after a few days of living there, I started noticing odd things. For one, Mason didn't seem to have any friends or guests over, which struck me as strange considering how much he talked about being involved in the community. But again, I kept my head down. I was just trying to survive the aftermath of my breakup and keep to myself. Then one Friday night, about a week after I moved in, things started getting weird. It had been a long week at work, so I stopped by the store on the way home and grabbed a six-pack. I figured I'd just crack open a beer and watch some TV before bed. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through channels, when Mason walked in. As soon as he saw the bottle in my hand, he froze. His whole body went rigid. Then, his face twisted into this look of pure, unfiltered anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his voice low but shaky, like he was holding back something much worse. It was like the vibe you get from a pissed-off parent who's about to go off on you. I blinked, confused. Just having a beer? Is that okay?" His voice got louder with each word. "You're drinking in my house? Do you have any idea how disgusting that is? How vile?" I sat there, stunned. I didn't know what to say. "It's just a beer, man. I didn't think—" "That's the problem," he cut me off, his face red and his eyes wild. "You didn't think." Before I could even react, he marched over, grabbed the beer from my hand, and slammed it down on the coffee table so hard I thought it would break. "This is a Christian home," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "Alcohol is a sin. I won't have it in here. You're poisoning yourself, and worse, you're poisoning my house." I was still processing all of this when he stood there, glaring at me, his hands shaking. I had never seen anyone so worked up over something so small. I knew some people didn't drink, but this was next level. All right, I said, trying to calm things down. "It's your house. I'll get rid of it." I grabbed the beer and walked to the kitchen, feeling his eyes on me the entire time, like he was making sure I didn't even think about keeping a sip for myself. I poured it down the sink slowly, then turned back to him, raising my hands in surrender. "It's gone. I won't bring any more in. Okay?" Mason just stood there, staring at me, his face tight. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. "Good. See that you don't," he said, his voice still thick with anger. I didn't stick around after that. I went straight back to my room, heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped something terrible. After that whole mess with the beer, I just needed to get away. So, I left the house for the night. I went to a bar to clear my head and ended up staying out way too late. I was drunk by the time I finally made it back to the house. When I got in, Mason's door was closed, and the house was dark. I assumed he was asleep. I crashed on my bed, hoping things would blow over by morning, but they didn't. The next few days were awkward, to put it mildly. Mason hardly spoke to me, and when he did, his words were short, cold, and harsh. I tried to stay out of his way, but it felt like he was always watching me. Every time I walked into a room, I could feel his eyes on me, like he was waiting for me to slip up again. It was all just so weird. He'd never mentioned anything about his house being alcohol-free, and if it was that important to him, he definitely should have mentioned it in his post. A few nights later, I decided to test my luck. I stopped by the store after work and picked up another six-pack. This time, though, I was extra careful. I snuck the beers into my room, drank them quietly, and made sure to hide the evidence. I went out onto the porch afterward just to be alone for a bit. The air was cool, the sky was clear, and I sipped my beer in peace, feeling like I'd somehow outsmarted him. It was ridiculous, really. A grown man sneaking beers like a teenager. I almost had to laugh at myself, but I felt good, like I had managed to avoid another fight with Mason. I went to bed feeling a little tipsy, but relieved. That feeling didn't last long. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It was soft at first, almost like someone whispering. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it felt like it was right at the foot of my bed. Still groggy, I blinked into the dark, trying to make sense of what was going on. And then I saw him. Mason was standing there, just inches away from my face. His face was so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. He was sniffing me, like he was trying to smell the alcohol. His lips were moving, and I could hear him muttering under his breath. It sounded like he was praying, but it was so low and weird I couldn't understand a word of it. I froze, heart racing. I tried to sit up, but something was wrong. My right hand was stuck. I looked down and realized with growing panic that my wrist was zip-tied to the bed frame. "Mason, what the hell?" I stammered, but he cut me off before I could finish. His voice was low, almost growling. "You drank again, didn't you?" he hissed. "You've defiled this house with your sin." My chest was pounding as I struggled against the zip tie, trying to pull my hand free. Okay, I'm sorry. I'll leave. I'll move out. Just let me go." But Mason wasn't listening. His eyes were wide, frantic. He was breathing heavily, like he was losing control. "It's too late for that," he said, almost gasping. "You've been corrupted. You need to be cleansed." I felt my blood run cold. He raised his arms above his head, his fingers twitching like he was getting ready to do something insane. And then he started chanting. It was in a language I didn't recognize, like scripture, but twisted and distorted into something dark. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. I kept trying to break free, but the tie was too tight. My mind was racing, but I couldn't think straight. I couldn't focus on anything except the terror building in my chest. What was he going to do? Was this some kind of joke? Or had I just stumbled into something way worse than I could even understand? At that moment, I realized that everything had gone wrong. What had started as a simple room rental had turned into something I couldn't escape from. Mason wasn't just weird, he was dangerous. And I had no idea what was coming next. His face was glowing with this strange intensity, his eyes wide, unblinking, like he was caught in some trance. My wrist was still tied to the bed, but I pulled at the zip tie with all the strength I had, and somehow it snapped. I scrambled out of the bed, shoving Mason out of the way as I bolted for the door. He didn't physically try to stop me, but he stood in the doorway, blocking my escape. His hands were still raised like he was in the middle of some bizarre ritual, muttering to himself in that twisted language. It was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen, almost like he was a puppet being controlled by something invisible. "Mason, move!" I yelled, but he didn't budge. He just stood there, staring at me with those wild, unblinking eyes. I didn't have the strength to fight him. Technically, he was the landlord, and I wasn't sure how far I could push things before it turned against me. I grabbed my phone, my wallet, and a few clothes. In a split-second decision, I didn't try to get past him again. Instead, I opened the window, climbed out, and dropped down into the backyard. My room was on the first floor, so it wasn't hard to make a quick escape. I thought for sure that would snap him out of it. But he didn't move. He just kept chanting, like he was in some kind of trance, then slammed the window shut behind me as I climbed out. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Part of me half expected to turn around and see Mason standing in the front yard, but he wasn't there. He didn't come out at all. I called one of my friends, one of the few who hadn't completely sided with my ex. I told him everything, and he let me crash at his place that night. The next morning, I went back to Mason's house with the police. I wanted to get my stuff and get the hell out of there for good. When we arrived, Mason answered the door with a kind of energy I hadn't seen from him before. In fact, he looked almost normal. He'd showered, shaved, and even brushed his hair. He was like a completely different person. It was like he'd been expecting us. The officers explained what had happened, that I just wanted to get my things, and Mason shook his head like he had no clue what they were talking about. He acted like he didn't know what the problem was, and, to my complete shock, he lied through his teeth. It was such a smooth lie that I was stunned how well it worked. He agreed to let me pack up my stuff, and the cops just nodded at me like everything was fine. But when Mason looked at me, I swear he gave me this psychotic grin, like he was saying, "Yeah, I got you." It was like a game to him. He had this sick pleasure in manipulating the situation. I was just trying to get my things and leave, so I didn't argue. One of the officers stayed at the front door, while the other walked through the house with me. Mason followed us around, giving me this creepy, smug expression, but neither of us said much. I didn't want to provoke him again. Finally, I packed up my car and handed Mason the key. I was done. I didn't want to see that guy again. Ever. I found a place to stay, one that didn't have a maniacal landlord, and slowly started to get back on my feet. But I still think about that house. I don't know if Mason was just one of those religious fanatics who completely lost it in the moment, or if something darker was going on in that house. Something that I'll never fully understand. All I know is that I got out, and I never looked back. This happened around 2 years ago, not long after I finished college and moved into my first apartment. I was new to the city and didn't know anyone at all. I remembered this guy, Jake, from school. We were in a few classes together, but we never really hung out much. We weren't close, but we recognized each other, so we agreed to room together. The apartment was decent, with 2 bedrooms and a pretty spacious living room. Our rooms were across from each other down a small hallway. At first, everything seemed fine. Jake and I didn't talk much, but we were both busy with work, so it was easy to just do our own thing. We'd exchange a few words here and there, but that was about it. Then things started getting weird. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of knocking. It was soft at first, then louder, like someone was tapping on my door. I was disoriented and confused at first, but when I realized what was happening, I figured it was Jake. Maybe he was just knocking to ask something or get my attention. So, I got up, turned on the light, and opened my door, but there was no one there. I immediately went over to Jake's room. His door was shut, and the lights were off. I knocked quietly and asked, "Jake? Was that you knocking?" No response. It sounded like he was still asleep. I looked around the apartment, but there was nobody else there. It freaked me out, but I just went back to bed, hoping it was nothing. The next day, I mentioned it to Jake. He was surprised and said he had slept through the whole night and hadn't heard anything at all. He swore he wasn't the one knocking. I had no reason to think he was lying, and it was just as creepy to him as it was to me. I asked if he'd ever sleepwalked, but he said no, never. So I just brushed it off. But then, the same thing happened the very next night. The knocking woke me up again, and this time, I didn't hesitate. I called out, "Who's there?" But there was only silence. I jumped out of bed, threw the door open, and looked down the hall. Nothing. But as I stood there, I could hear Jake's door closing down the hallway, and I thought I saw something move at the corner of my vision. A dark figure, maybe, but I couldn't be sure. I couldn't make out much, but I was pretty sure it was him. I rushed over to Jake's room, threw open the door, and there he was, lying in bed, pretending to sleep. I stood there for a moment, feeling a chill creep up my spine. I asked him what the hell he was doing, knocking on my door in the middle of the night. He didn't answer. I couldn't tell if he was just pretending to be asleep or if he'd actually been sleepwalking, but it was clear something wasn't right. The next morning, I tried bringing it up. Jake just looked confused, saying he didn't remember doing anything. Maybe he had sleepwalked after all, he said, but it still didn't sit well with me. A few nights later, the knocking came again, but this time it was much louder. I jolted out of bed, and before I could even make it to the door, I saw him dart back into his room. The sound of his door slamming shut followed, and I was done. I'd had enough. This was getting way too weird. I told Jake I was moving out, but I didn't give him the real reason. I didn't want to hurt his feelings or make things uncomfortable. I told him I just needed my own space now, that I was making enough money to live alone. I insisted it wasn't personal, but deep down, I wasn't sure if he was sleepwalking or messing with me on purpose. I found a small one-bedroom place a few miles away, still in the same city. It was on the first floor, and I had the whole apartment to myself. It was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I could breathe again. But about a week after I moved in, I was woken up in the dead of night. It wasn't the usual knocking on my door this time. It was coming from the window. I squinted, my heart racing, and when I looked over, I saw Jake standing outside, knocking on my window. My stomach dropped. I jumped out of bed, but the second I did, he ran off into the darkness. It felt unreal. How the hell did he find my new place? I had never told him where I moved to. Not a single word. I called him up the next day, feeling a mix of anger and fear. When I told him what happened, he acted like I was crazy, denied everything. I told him straight up, if you ever do that again, I'll call the police. That was the last time I ever heard from him. He disappeared after that, and I haven't seen or heard from him since. I was coming back from a long day of school and work. It was around 9 p.m., and as soon as I stepped into my apartment, something hit me. There was this horrible smell in the air. At first, I thought it might be something I left in the kitchen, but as I walked further inside, it was definitely stronger. My first thought was to check on Ryan. He was my roommate and a good friend, and if anyone knew what was going on, it'd be him. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer, which was strange. Ryan was always home by now and always quick to answer the door. I knocked again, a little harder this time, and called out, "Yo, Ryan, you in there? You awake?" Still nothing. By then, I was starting to get a little freaked out. Normally, he would have answered. I thought about just barging in, but I didn't want to be rude or invade his space, so I just waited. A couple of hours passed, and the smell kept getting worse. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled before, some kind of mix of rot and decay. I started texting Ryan, calling him non-stop. I must have left about 5 or 6 voicemails, but he didn't reply to a single one. That was really unusual. Ryan wasn't the type to ignore his phone, especially if something was wrong. I want to make it clear before I go further that this isn't for the faint of heart. I'm putting a trigger warning here because I don't want anyone coming back to me saying they weren't warned. So, a few more hours passed, and by then, I couldn't take it anymore. The stench was unbearable, and it was clear now that it was coming from Ryan's room. At this point, I didn't care if he was in there or what he was doing. I was about to find out what the hell was causing this smell. I banged on the door one more time and shouted, "Ryan, if you're in there, I'm coming in." I turned the doorknob, but of course the door was locked. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed a bobby pin from the bathroom, went back to the door, and started picking the lock. It took a while, but eventually the door clicked open. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me like a wall. It was so much worse than before, like something rotting was just seeping through the air. I followed the stench, and it led me straight to Ryan's closet. I couldn't believe what I saw. There, in the corner, was a black garbage bag with something sticking out of it. I took a step closer and realized it was an animal leg. I froze for a second, trying to make sense of it. Then I saw the maggots crawling all over the bag. It was worse than any nightmare. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there, staring. The smell was almost unbearable, but I had to know more. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget that smell. It was so bad, I almost threw up right there. I had no idea what kind of animal it was at first, but after looking closer, I figured it was a dog. I don't care if I sound like a softie here. What I saw was just messed up. I immediately called the police. I didn't care if it made me a snitch. I just needed to make sure this was reported. I told the dispatcher everything, and within 10 minutes, the cops were at my door. They went straight to the closet, and within seconds, they confirmed what I feared. It was a pit bull, beaten to death. Its head was almost completely severed. I couldn't watch them pull the poor thing out of that room. I'm an animal lover, and seeing that made my stomach turn. I nearly had a panic attack right there. After they took the dog away, we waited for Ryan to show up. An hour passed, but there was still no sign of him. The cops told me they'd keep an eye out for him and to call them if he showed up. But honestly, I wasn't staying another minute in that apartment. I didn't even think twice. I packed my things the next morning and left. I had a month-to-month lease, so I just broke it and never looked back. I blocked Ryan on every platform. I didn't want to know where he was, didn't want to deal with him ever again. Word started spreading around town that he was missing, but honestly, I couldn't care less. He was a monster. I sometimes think back on it and wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone into his room that night. What if I hadn't found that poor dog? Would Ryan have gone after me too? Would he have hurt me? The cops put out a warrant for his arrest, and I really hope they catch him. He's got what's coming to him. What's crazy is that he was a close friend of mine for years. We went to school together since first grade, all the way through senior year. To think that the person I knew was capable of something like this still blows my mind. Ryan was messed up, and I didn't see it until it was too late. So, I'm a senior now at this big college, but things didn't always seem like they'd go this way. I moved here a few years ago, transferring from a smaller school. I spent only my freshman year there, but honestly, I should have left even earlier. When I got to the new school, I didn't know a soul. I was stuck with the dorms, and like it or not, I got a random roommate. His name was Brian. He was tall, pretty skinny, with blonde hair and glasses. I remember the first thing he told me after I moved in. "I'm crazy. You never know what I'll do next." It sounded like a joke at first, so I laughed, and he did too. But looking back, I can tell you, I should have listened to that gut feeling. At first, he just seemed odd. He'd say strange things, make jokes that didn't land right, and had these weird moods where he'd disappear or show up at the oddest times. I'm talking like he'd vanish for hours. Other times, he wouldn't leave the room at all. I'd even wake up sometimes in the middle of the night and see him slipping out with a jacket on or his backpack. I'd just lie there pretending to be asleep, not wanting to get involved. The first couple of weeks, I tried to ignore it. I mean, we'd hang out every now and then, doing homework, talking a little. It wasn't awful, just uncomfortable. But then, towards the end of my first semester, I was just about done with the guy. One evening, out of nowhere, he casually says, "I was watching you sleep last night." He laughed after, like it was no big deal, and I chuckled along because it felt too awkward not to. But deep down, something in me went cold. I didn't know why, but it freaked me out more than I let on. Things didn't really change after that. When second semester started, everything felt like it was back to how it was before. Same weird vibes, random disappearances, and those strange moments when I'd wake up and just sense him in the room, but not see him. But then, one night, something happened that made me question everything. I woke up, but not because of any noise or movement, just something was off. I had no idea what time it was, I barely opened my eyes, and when I did, I saw him. Brian, standing at the foot of my bed, staring right at me. It was dark, but I knew it was him. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. I didn't even sit up or say a word. I just closed my eyes and tried to fall back asleep. It didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt wrong. Something told me not to look again, not to let him know I was awake. But my heart was pounding. I didn't feel safe. I figured he'd eventually leave, but he didn't. I couldn't stop myself from sneaking a glance with my eyes barely open, and yep, Brian was still there, standing at the foot of my bed. He didn't move. He stayed like that for what felt like forever. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe more. I honestly have no clue what he was doing. Was he sleepwalking? It's the only explanation I could come up with. But when I woke up in the morning and could think straight again, I remembered what he'd said before about watching me sleep. That wasn't a joke, was it? He had really meant it, but why? Why would anyone do that? I tried to brush it off as one of his weird jokes, but it happened again. A few weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night, and there he was, standing at my bed again, just staring. This time, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up quickly, and as soon as I did, Brian snapped backward and bolted out of the room. I yelled, asking him what the hell was going on, but he didn't say a word. He didn't stop. He just ran. By the time I fell back asleep, he still wasn't back, and when I woke up, I found the room empty. I didn't see him again until that night. When Brian finally returned, I asked him straight out what was going on. Why the hell was he watching me sleep? At first, he looked at me like I was the crazy one. He actually denied it. He said I must have been dreaming or something. I was so confused. He had literally told me before that he watched me sleep. I wasn't sure if I was more annoyed or terrified at this point, but I just went along with it. I said, "Oh, guess I was just dreaming then," and laughed, though it felt more like I was trying to convince myself it wasn't as weird as it really was. Then, about a week later, something even stranger happened. I was sitting at my desk doing homework. Our dorm was on the 4th floor, the top floor, and in the summer, it would get crazy hot in there. So, we'd keep the window open for some fresh air. It was a huge window that looked out over the campus. Anyway, I was sitting there one night trying to focus, when Brian casually says, "You know, one day, I'm just going to push you out of that window." He said it with a laugh, but the more I thought about it, the less funny it seemed. I laughed along with him because that's what you do in these situations, right? But the truth is, I didn't like it. Not one bit. My gut was telling me something was really off with him. The next few days, I found myself checking behind me, making sure I wasn't standing too close to the window. Not long after that, the whole world flipped upside down. It was March 2020, and suddenly, everyone, including me and Brian, was sent home because of COVID. Classes went online for the rest of the semester, and I didn't see him again after that. By the time the fall rolled around, I had transferred to another school. I try not to think about Brian too much, but sometimes I wonder, was he actually planning to push me out of that window? I don't really think he would have gone that far, but honestly, after living with him, I wouldn't put it past him. He was just so unpredictable. So, this all happened back in the summer of 2018, right after I graduated high school. I had been working for about 2 years and was finally in a good place to move out. My plan was simple: get a cheap one-bedroom apartment downtown. It was close to my old school and, like 5 of my friends were already living in the same building. It seemed perfect. I'd still be near everyone, and everything I needed was just around the corner: grocery store, parks, all that. I had saved up $10,000, had no debt, and my car was paid off. Life felt pretty good. I applied for the apartment online, and when I found out I got it, I was stoked. Having my own space felt amazing. Finally, I could live on my own terms, decorate however I wanted, and just relax. Things went smoothly for the first week or so, but then, well, that's when everything changed. It started out with Aaron and Rob, 2 of my close friends, who lived on the 3rd floor of the building, just a couple of apartments above mine. I'd hang out with them sometimes, but it was nothing too serious. But then, after a while, they started coming over more and more. At first, I didn't mind, but eventually, they were over at my place every day. It wasn't long before they stayed for 2 full days straight. I was starting to feel like I didn't even live alone anymore, and I really wasn't used to that. I mean, I'm an introvert. I just wanted some space to myself. So I gently told them, "Hey, I need some alone time. Can you guys leave for a bit?" It was kind of awkward, but I thought they'd get the hint. They didn't. Instead, they started showing up even more. My apartment quickly became the go-to spot for everyone, and honestly, I was getting fed up. I had just moved out to be alone, and now it felt like I couldn't get any peace. Then one day, Aaron dropped a bombshell on me. He told me that him and Rob had just been evicted. They didn't have anywhere to go for a few weeks, and they asked if they could crash at my place. That really threw me off. I was stuck. I didn't want to be a jerk, but at the same time, I really wasn't sure how to handle it. I didn't want to just kick them out, especially since they made me feel guilty. I mean, they were friends, right? So, I ended up telling them they could stay for 2 weeks. But of course, 2 weeks turned into a month, then another, and eventually it stretched to almost 2 months. I guess I was just a bit of a softie when it came to helping people, especially my friends. But looking back, I was an idiot. They weren't my friends. They were just using me for a place to crash. They didn't care about my space or my boundaries. Every night they'd bring over random people, blast music until 1 a.m., and throw wild parties. People I didn't know would be smoking, drinking, and causing a ruckus. The cops were called a few times, and I swear I thought for sure I'd be kicked out. Honestly, I'm still shocked I wasn't. One night, it finally hit me. I had enough. I had been trying to sleep, and every time I asked them to keep it down, they just ignored me. So, I snapped. I got out of bed, stormed into the living room, and kicked everyone out. Every single person, including Aaron and Rob. It took forever to get them to leave. Around 20 minutes of me arguing and threatening to call the police before they finally packed up and left. I was exhausted and just wanted peace. But of course, they didn't leave without leaving me with a disaster. The place was trashed. Empty bottles, cigarette butts, leftover pizza. I figured I'd clean it up later. I was way too tired and just wanted to sleep. The next morning, I woke up super early around 6 a.m., my head pounding like a drum. I stumbled out of my room in just my boxers, still half asleep, rubbing my eyes. That's when I froze. There, sitting on my couch like nothing had happened, were Aaron and Rob. "What the hell are you doing here?" I yelled. "Get out! Now!" Aaron just looked at me like I was being unreasonable. "Chill, dude, we're not going anywhere," he said with a smirk. I was so pissed, I didn't even bother arguing. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Before the cops showed up, though, they bolted. Of course, they had the spare key I'd given them when they first moved in. Big mistake on my part. I should have changed the locks the second they started overstaying their welcome. I really thought that would be the last of it, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be. I had no way of keeping them out without involving the cops. So I tried something else, something I hoped would put an end to it all. After everything that had happened, I wasn't taking any chances. I piled up whatever I could find, furniture, bags, even a bunch of books, right in front of my door. I wanted to make sure if they came back, it wouldn't be easy for them. I figured they'd given up for the night. By 10:30 p.m., it was quiet, and I was starting to relax. I even got lost in the movie I was watching, thinking it was finally over. But then, out of nowhere, I heard the sound of the door handle jiggling. I froze. "Are you kidding me? Not again," I muttered to myself. My stomach dropped. When are these idiots going to get the hint? At that point, I was seriously worried about what they might do. So, I grabbed my phone and called the cops once again. I wasn't even going to acknowledge them this time. They knocked and called out, "Yo, bro, let us in. We're sorry, man. It's freezing out here. Please, just one more night, and we'll leave for good. We won't mess it up, we swear." Something about the way they said it made my skin crawl. It didn't feel right. Their apology sounded fake. and I had this gut feeling that something was really off. But I wasn't about to fall for it. I ignored them and just sat there waiting for the police to show up. When they did, it was fast, thankfully. They took Aaron and Rob away without much hassle. But what I found out next made my blood run cold. They weren't just carrying the usual stuff, weed, alcohol, whatever. No, they had roofies, which was bad enough. But on top of that, they were carrying handcuffs, an illegal gun, knives, some weird rope, and even some other stuff that looked like it was meant for... I don't even want to think about it. I swear, that could have been a totally different situation if I had let them in. I was lucky. Real lucky. I got a restraining order against them, and the building management changed the locks for me. I never let anyone near that spare key again. The worst part? I don't know what they had planned for me that night, but the thought of it makes my skin crawl. Those guys were messed up in a way I didn't even realize. I mean, they were always a little off, but now I wonder if they were more dangerous than I could have imagined. They felt like the kind of guys who could end up being serial killers. It's like I narrowly escaped something way worse. I've never been the type of guy who's into violence or anything crazy. I was always the quiet one who focused on school and sports. Yeah, I'd drink with them sometimes, but after that night, I couldn't even stand the thought of alcohol anymore. I've had no desire to touch it since. It just leaves a bad taste in my mouth now. This happened about 4 years ago, and I'm 22 now when I'm telling this story. After I turned 18, I couldn't wait to leave my parents' house. We didn't exactly get along back then. I was stubborn, always arguing, and honestly, a pain to deal with. They weren't perfect either, but I won't pretend I was the angel in the situation. Thankfully, things are a lot better now. We've worked through a lot, but there were years when things were pretty bad at home. I'll admit I was part of the problem, but it wasn't all on me either. Most of my friends had good relationships with their parents, and they didn't want to move out yet. They all had jobs, were in school, and had their lives somewhat together. But me? I couldn't wait to get out. I remember my parents threatening to kick me out every time I'd get caught smoking weed or drinking. It was a cycle. I'd pack up my stuff, leave, then they'd call the cops and report me as a runaway. I never ended up in juvenile detention, but I've spent a few nights in jail in a holding cell. They always called it a lesson, but I never really learned anything from it. I guess I was just too stubborn and hot-headed to take their advice. Since none of my friends were looking for roommates, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went on Craigslist and started looking for places. I was hoping to find something cheap. After scrolling for a bit, I came across a small house listed for $550 a month. That sounded way too good to be true, so I figured there had to be some catch. Still, I was curious, so I reached out. The lady didn't pick up when I called, so I left a voicemail. A little while later, I got a text back with the details. She wanted me to come see the house that night. I was skeptical, but I went. When I got there, she showed me the house and explained everything. It was small, but it looked all right, and the price seemed good for the area. We talked for a while, and honestly, I was excited. I thought this might be my chance to finally have a place to myself, away from the chaos at home. So, she didn't ask me to sign anything, or even fill out a rental agreement, which felt a little off. All she wanted was a small deposit, which I managed to scrape together. She told me I could move in the next day as long as I had the money, so I was ready. The next morning, I showed up at the house, handed over the cash, and she gave me the keys. I was pumped, so I started unloading my stuff from my truck. I had to run a few errands and grab some more things from my parents' place, so I didn't get back until around 8:30 p.m. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed her car was still there, which struck me as odd. It made me feel a bit uneasy, but I brushed it off. When I opened the door, I was in for a surprise. There she was, sitting on the couch in the living room, watching TV like she owned the place. I stood there for a second, totally confused. What are you doing here?" I asked, a little annoyed. "Is there something going on I don't know about?" She looked up and casually told me, "Oh, I'm just staying here for a bit until I can find my own place." I was in shock. I had rented this place thinking it was just for me. Now, out of nowhere, she's telling me she plans on staying here too? I asked her how long she planned on sticking around, and she said, a few days. I didn't know what to think. I was already tired and just wanted to relax. I figured, whatever, it's just a few days. I went to my room and tried to ignore the weirdness. That night, I made a huge mistake by just trying to sleep through it. I should have said something then, but I was exhausted. The lady was at least 65, so I figured I'd be fine if she tried anything weird. I locked my bedroom door just in case, though, because I didn't trust the situation one bit. About half an hour later, I woke up to the sound of music blasting from the living room. I was already annoyed and didn't want to deal with it, but I got up and went to ask her to turn it down. I knocked on my bedroom door, stepped into the hall, and called out to her. When I did, she didn't say anything back. She just stared at me. That's it. No response. Just a blank look, like she hadn't even heard me. It made me feel uneasy, like she was in a different world. I stood there for a second, wondering if I should say something again, but it felt so wrong. Something wasn't right about her being in that house at all. I turned around and went back to my room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. She turned the music down a little, but didn't say a word. I eventually managed to fall back asleep, but when I woke up, what I experienced was so freaky, I still get chills thinking about it. There was a knock on my door. At first, it was soft, almost gentle. "Hello? What do you want?" "I'm trying to sleep here," I said, annoyed. Then I heard her voice. "Timmy, wake up," she said in this strange, sing-song tone. "Dinner's almost ready. Don't you want to make Mommy happy?" The moment she said that, something cold ran down my spine. I was frozen. My name isn't Timmy. Not even close. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was completely speechless. I just hoped she'd leave me alone. But instead, she knocked harder, banging on the door with both fists like she was pounding it in. And she started screaming, her voice getting louder with each word. "Let me in! I swear to God, if you don't open this door, it'll be the last thing you ever do, boy." I was terrified. I thought she might somehow get in, so I quickly shoved my dresser in front of the door to block it. My heart was racing as I grabbed my phone and rushed to open the window. I didn't even hesitate. I climbed out and ran straight to my truck. I was so scared, I didn't look back once. I just wanted to get as far away from that house as possible. It wasn't until a couple of weeks later that I found out the truth. Her son, Timmy, had been missing, and they eventually found his body, dead. Turns out, Eileen, the woman who'd rented me the house, had been charged with his murder. The police found out she had poisoned him. His body was buried in the backyard of the rental. It made sense now. Timmy's name, her obsession with me being Timmy, everything clicked. I can't wrap my head around what kind of person she was. I'm not sure if she actually thought I was her son, or if she was just so twisted that she was trying to recreate the whole situation. Maybe even try to kill me like she did him. It's impossible to say. Maybe she was so far gone that she believed I was Timmy. It all feels like a bad dream when I think about it. A part of me still feels like I narrowly escaped whatever sick plan she had for me. I'll never forget how close I came to ending up like Timmy. 6 feet under, just like him. If I'd eaten that dinner she made for me, I have no doubt in my mind I wouldn't be here telling you this story. I'm convinced she was planning on poisoning me too.